Tonight, the air carries the scent of cold soil and drying leaves. The lanterns on the porches burn low, their flames trembling in the breath of October. Somewhere beyond the trees, a dog barks once, short and uncertain, before falling silent. The wind moves softly through the tall grass, brushing the earth like a tired hand. The season is changing again, the last breath of autumn clinging to the land before the frost settles in. If you are joining from the United States, from Canada, from the United Kingdom, or from wherever the evening finds you, I welcome you warmly. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is where you are now. Is it dusk, where the sky has turned to embers, or deep into midnight, where the only light left is from your screen? Take a breath. Let the quiet of the room wrap around you. Settle beneath your blanket. Let your shoulders relax, and let your mind drift with me into a night long past. Press like if you enjoy traveling through these quiet moments in history. Subscribe if you wish to walk with me again through the places where memory lingers and time grows thin. Now we return to a place where the wind speaks through the timbers of old houses, and the ground remembers more than the living do. It is a night in New England, late in the 17th century, when the harvest is nearly finished and the moon hangs low over the fields. The land smells of pumpkins, smoke and wet bark. The trees stand black against the sky, their branches stripped bare. Each house holds its light close, its windows small and shuttered, as though trying to keep the cold from learning their secrets. The road is little more than a ribbon of packed earth, lined with stone walls that rise uneven and moss-covered. The ruts are deep from the carts that carried the last of the harvest home. On either side of the road stretch fields of dry corn stalks, their leaves rattling faintly whenever the wind stirs. The sound carries like a whisper, distant and hollow, an echo that folds into the dark. There are no carriages tonight, no travellers, no voices. Only the slow creak of a weathered sign swinging outside the tavern and the faint glow of its hearth seen through fogged glass. The village lies beyond the marsh, where the road dips low and the ground softens underfoot. A wooden bridge spans the shallow water, its planks slick with moisture. Beneath it the current moves slow and dark, reflecting the silver light of the half-moon. A man crossing there might pause and see his face ripple on the surface, pale and unsteady, and look away before the image settles. It was said that the marsh had taken many shapes over the years, that where it now lay flat and silent had once been a place of shouting and judgment. Few spoke of it aloud. The houses here are built close together, plain and square, their roofs steep against the weight of snow that will soon come. The chimneys smoke steadily, the scent of burning oak mingling with the faint sweetness of cider brewing. Doors are bolted, windows drawn, and yet the streets are not empty. A figure moves between the houses, carrying a small lantern that throws a soft yellow light along the cobbles. The glow catches the edge of a wooden fence, a stack of chopped logs, the curve of a bucket left beside a door. The light wavers and steadies, moving toward the meeting house where a bell hangs silent in its frame. The hour is late, but sleep does not come easily to this place. Fear runs thin and steady through the blood of the village. It has been years since the gallows on the hill stood bare. The memory of them still clings to the soil. In daylight, people speak of providence, of duty, of the Lord's will. But in the hours between prayers, they whisper of other things. They whisper of the woman who lived at the edge of the wood, whose chimney never stopped smoking, whose cat followed no one but her. They whisper of milk that soured overnight, of footsteps in the loft when the house was empty, of candles that burned with blue flames. They say the devil walks quieter than a man's shadow, and that he prefers the company of those who think themselves righteous. Inside one of the houses, the fire burns low. The room smells of tallow, damp wood, and the faint sweetness of drying apples hung near the ceiling. The beams above are heavy and uneven, blackened by years of smoke. A Bible rests open on the table, though the flame near it trembles so faintly that the words are little more than shadows. A man sits at the table, his sleeves rolled, his hands folded tight. His knuckles are pale, his eyes set on the candle. He does not blink often. In the corner, a woman mends a torn sleeve by lamplight. Her fingers move carefully, the needle flashing now and again. She does not look at the man, nor he at her. The only sound is the steady crack of wood in the hearth. Outside, the fields stretch silent and wide. The pumpkins, left too long on the vine, have taken on deep ridges, their skins hardened and glistening in the cold air. Some have been gathered already, hollowed with care and carved by hand, not in the playful manner of later centuries, but as a warning, a ward. Triangles cut for eyes, narrow slits for mouths, their faces crude but deliberate. Each holds a candle stub inside, its light faint but steady, flickering in the wind. These are not decorations, they are guardians. To the Puritan eye, the devil was never far, and even a carved pumpkin might serve to trick the wandering spirit or confuse the gaze of evil. The smell of burning gourd drifts through the night, sharp and earthy. Somewhere a barn door shifts on its hinges, creaking once, then again. A pair of oxen shift in their stalls, the chain between them rattling softly. The stable boy, no older than 12, glances toward the sound but says nothing. He has been told never to speak when the wind comes from the east, not after dark. He finishes scattering the last of the hay, pats the flank of the nearest animal, and hurries back toward the house, his footsteps muffled on the packed earth. Behind him, the faint orange glow of the lanterns flickers in the fields, scattered like watchful eyes. Near the edge of the village stands a small cottage apart from the rest, its roof sagging under the weight of age. The shutters are drawn tight, but the faint line of light slips through the cracks. Inside, a woman sits by the hearth, her hands steady as she grinds dried herbs in a wooden bowl. The sound is soft, rhythmic, almost soothing. Bundles of rosemary and sage hang above her, their scent filling the small room. On the table beside her lies a single candle, its flame bent low as though listening. The woman hums softly under her breath, the tune old, wordless, carried from somewhere across the ocean long before she was born. On her windowsill sits a small pumpkin, uncarved, its surface traced with faint white chalk marks that catch the firelight. It watches the door like an unblinking eye. The people of the village call her the Widow Crane. They say her husband drowned in the marsh one autumn night when the moon was full, though no body was ever found. Since then, her chimney has burned longer than anyone else's, and her door has remained closed. Some claim she knows the language of crows. Others whisper she can still hear her husband's voice in the fog. The minister has spoken against her from the pulpit more than once, warning of false piety and hidden sin, but even he passes her house without pausing when the sun goes down. Beyond the cottage, the marsh spreads wide and low, its surface a dull mirror reflecting the thin slice of moon. The reed sways slowly, whispering in a language too old for the living to understand. Now and then, the surface breaks with a quiet splash, as though something beneath shifts in its sleep. The night air grows colder here, heavy with the smell of wet decay, and the faint sweetness of peat. A thin mist rolls across the ground, wrapping around the fence posts and curling low against the grass. It creeps toward the road, slow and deliberate, and soon the lanterns burn within it, like faint orange stars floating in fog. The village bell, silent since sunset, trembles once in the tower. The rope sways though no hand touches it. The sound it makes is barely a whisper, more felt than heard, a hollow vibration that passes through the wood and vanishes into the night. A few dogs begin to bark, their voices sharp and uncertain, then one by one fall quiet. The windows of the meeting house glimmer faintly, their reflections caught in the slow-moving mist. Within the Widow Crane's cottage, the herbs in the bowl have turned to fine powder. She lifts a small handful, holding it briefly above the flame before letting it fall into the fire. The smoke that rises is pale and thin, carrying a scent of lavender and salt. She watches it coil upward and disappear into the chimney, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. Her cat, a small black creature with dull yellow eyes, stretches along the hearth and lets out a slow breath. The woman's lips move, though no sound follows. The candle flickers once, then steadies, burning straight and silent. In the village, a door opens. A man steps out into the night, his coat drawn tight around him. He looks toward the marsh, where the mist lies thickest, and hesitates before pulling his hat low over his brow and walking down the lane. His boots strike the stones with a deliberate rhythm. Somewhere behind him a shutter creaks. He does not turn. The fog thickens as he moves, the air damp against his skin, the smell of decay clinging to every breath. He carries no lantern, only the faint light from the windows behind him fading slowly into the dark. The wind changes direction, coming now from the north, carrying with it a sharper chill. It passes through the bare trees, over the fields, and through the gaps between the houses. It makes the pumpkins flicker, their faces bending in and out of shadow. The mist shivers, folding back upon itself, and for a moment the road ahead vanishes entirely. The man stops, waiting for the air to clear, but it does not. He can hear water moving somewhere close, slow and heavy. He takes a step forward, careful, feeling the damp earth soften under his boots. Another step, then another, until the faint shape of the bridge emerges before him. The railing is slick with moisture. He grips it lightly, leaning over to look into the black water below. For a heartbeat, he sees nothing. Then a ripple disturbs the surface, small but deliberate, as if something beneath has just turned its gaze upward. The man steps back. His breath rises in the cold air. Behind him, the lanterns in the field continue to burn, steady and watchful. From the direction of the widow's cottage comes a thin line of smoke, pale and unbroken against the dark. The man glances toward it, then down once more into the water. The surface is calm now, but the reflection that looks back is not his own. Far away, in the woods beyond the marsh, the trees shift with the movement of wind. Their branches creak and sway, brushing against each other with dry whispers. Something unseen passes through the undergrowth, careful, silent, its steps measured. The forest does not resist its movement. It merely listens. The leaves tremble once, then settle again. The road behind the man remains empty, though his footsteps still echo faintly in the damp air, as though another walks beside him. The houses of the village stand dark and still. From one chimney rises a last thin plume of smoke, curling lazily before fading into the grey sky. The bell in the meeting house gives a single hollow sound, not enough to wake, just enough to remind. The mist thickens again, swallowing the road, the bridge, the fields, until all that remains visible are the faint glows of the pumpkins, their faces flickering gently in the wind, guarding the sleeping village as midnight draws near. And so the night deepens, slow and deliberate, pressing its cold fingers against the walls of the houses. The fields lie silent, the marsh breathes softly, and the fire in each hearth burns low. The people dream of things they do not name. The widow crane sits awake still, her candle unflinching, her eyes on the window where the fog gathers thick against the glass. Somewhere beyond it, something stirs. The cat lifts its head, ears twitching toward the door. The woman's hand rests on the table beside the candle, waiting. The flame bends once, then steadies again. The morning comes slowly, though the sun does not break easily through the haze. The mist hangs heavy over the marsh, its grey folds wrapping the land in silence. The air is damp, smelling of peat, old wood and cold water. Along the road, puddles gleam faintly, catching thin ribbons of light from the sky. Somewhere far off, a rooster calls once, its voice muffled by distance, and then all is still again. The village stirs late. Smoke rises from a few chimneys, slow and uncertain, curling upward before dissolving into the fog. Doors open one by one, the sound of latches and hinges echoing faintly through the narrow lanes. The first voices of the day are quiet, spoken low between neighbours who glance at one another but do not linger. The people here have grown used to speaking softly. The air seems to hold memory, and too much noise feels like trespassing upon it. The ground is slick from the night's dew. A woman steps carefully across the packed earth, her skirts brushing the tops of her boots. In her hands, she carries a basket filled with dried herbs and a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. She walks toward the edge of the village, where the ground slopes down toward the marsh. The fog grows thicker there, but she does not turn back. She knows the path well enough to walk it by feel. The fence posts along the way lean at odd angles, their wood dark with moisture. Crows sit upon them in still silence, their feathers dull in the grey light. The woman's breath comes slow and visible, rising in faint plumes. She passes the last of the houses, where the thatch gives way to damp reeds and the smell of salt grows stronger. The marsh stretches wide before her now, the surface of the water unbroken except for the faint ripples of movement beneath. She stops near the edge, sets down the basket, and kneels. Her hands move with practiced care as she unwraps the bread and places it upon a flat stone. She sprinkles a handful of herbs over it, murmuring under her breath words that sound more like habit than prayer. When she finishes, she straightens slowly, her knees stiff from the cold. The crows shift upon the fence posts, one letting out a single hollow call that echoes faintly across the water. The offering will remain there until dusk. It is an old custom, one that came long before any minister's word, meant for the ones who never left the marsh. Some say they still walk there when the fog grows thick enough to hide their shape. The woman does not look back as she returns to the village, her steps steady, her face unreadable. The houses are built close together here, a cluster of wood and stone pressed against the edge of the wetland. The paint has long since peeled from their walls, and the shutters hang uneven, patched and repaired over generations. The streets are narrow, barely wide enough for a cart, and the air smells always of wood smoke, salt, and damp earth. The people who live here know the sound of every hinge, every door latch, every cough from a neighbour's throat. Privacy is rare, but trust is rarer still. Near the centre of the village stands the meeting house, square and plain, its white boards weathered grey. The windows are small and high, and the bell above them hangs motionless in its frame. Inside, the air is cold and dry. Wooden benches line the floor, their surfaces smooth from decades of hands and knees. The pulpit stands raised above them, the single candle upon it burned down to a stub. A Bible rests beside it, its pages curled at the edges from years of use. Dust floats in the light that filters through the windows, and the silence feels thick enough to press against the skin. The minister arrives just after sunrise. He moves with care, his black coat buttoned high against the chill. His face is long, his eyes sharp, his beard streaked with grey. He does not speak as he enters, only pauses to brush the moisture from his boots before walking to the pulpit. He places both hands on the wood and stands for a long moment, staring at nothing. The quiet of the room feels heavy around him. Finally, he exhales and begins to pray, his voice low, steady, and without pause. Outside, the fog lifts slowly from the marsh, revealing narrow channels of dark water that twist through the reeds. The trees along the far edge stand bare and thin, their trunks pale against the grey. A heron moves through the shallows, its long legs silent, its reflection faint and wavering. The sound of its wings, when it finally lifts off, cuts through the stillness like a blade. In one of the smaller houses near the meeting hall, a child sits by the window watching the mist unravel. The glass is uneven, and the view beyond wavers like water. He holds a small wooden figure in his hand, its surface worn smooth by touch. The toy has no face, only the faint outline of arms and legs. He drags it slowly across the table, tracing invisible lines. His mother moves behind him, folding linen, her motions quick and practiced. She hums softly to herself, though the sound is barely more than breath. When she glances toward the window, her expression tightens. The child looks up, sensing the change, but she says nothing. She only pulls the curtains closed and tells him to fetch more wood for the fire. The boy obeys, crossing the room to the door where the morning light spills in. Outside, the air bites cold against his face. He hurries toward the woodpile, his boots slipping slightly in the mud. The logs are stacked high against the side of the house, still damp from the mist. He lifts one, then another, and pauses when he hears movement from the lane. A figure passes at the far end, wrapped in a dark cloak, the hood drawn low. The boy squints through the fog, but cannot make out the face. The figure moves slowly, deliberately, not glancing left or right. When it disappears around the corner, the boy drops the logs and runs back inside. At the edge of the village, smoke rises from a single chimney where the widow crane's house stands apart. The roof glistens faintly with moisture, and the narrow path leading to her door is overgrown with wild grass. She steps outside, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders, a wooden bowl balanced in one hand. The air carries the faint hum of her voice, low and steady, as she scatters the contents of the bowl onto the ground, crushed herbs mixed with ash. The wind stirs them into faint grey spirals before they vanish into the damp soil. She watches until the last of the powder disappears, then turns back inside. The people of the village avoid her even in daylight, though none can say exactly why. Some claim she was once a healer when healers were still tolerated. Others say she speaks to things no longer living. Her name is seldom spoken aloud, replaced instead by murmurs of the widow or the one by the marsh. The children are warned not to wander near her door, though sometimes, when curiosity overcomes fear, they sneak close enough to peer through the cracks in her fence. What they see depends on who tells the story. A single candle burning at all hours, a line of dried flowers hung upside down from the rafters, a mirror covered in cloth even at midday. By noon, the fog begins to thin. The fields beyond the village stretch out in muted colour, grey soil, yellowing stalks, and the dull orange of pumpkins left to rot where they lay. The men work in silence, gathering the last of what the ground will give. The rhythm of tools against earth carries faintly through the still air, steady as breathing. The women move between the houses, hanging wet linens on ropes strung between the eaves. The cloth flutters weakly in the light breeze, pale shapes against the weathered wood. Somewhere a door slams, followed by the sound of a broom sweeping across stone. The day unfolds without haste, each action deliberate, measured, as though everyone is waiting for something unseen to pass. In the late afternoon, the minister leaves the meeting house and walks toward the edge of the marsh. His boots sink slightly into the soft ground, leaving prints that fill slowly with water. He stops near the same flat stone where the woman left her offering earlier. The bread remains untouched, though the herbs have darkened from damp. He stares at it for a long while, then reaches down and picks up a piece, breaking it in half. He drops one into the water and keeps the other in his hand. The crows shift on the fence behind him, their wings rustling softly. He mutters something, not scripture, not quite prayer, before tossing the rest of the bread into the reeds. The water closes over it without a sound. He stands there for several minutes, his expression hidden beneath the brim of his hat. When he finally turns back toward the village, the wind changes again. It comes low across the marsh, carrying a smell that is not quite earth and not quite rot. He breathes it in once and keeps walking. Evening approaches slowly. The sky turns the colour of old iron, and the first lanterns appear in the windows. Their light flickers faintly in the mist, reflections trembling across the puddles that line the road. The smell of cooking drifts through the air. Salt pork, boiled cabbage, bread baked in ash. From one house comes the faint sound of a fiddle, though it stops almost as soon as it starts. The village seems to draw tighter as darkness comes, each door closing, each window shuttered. The air grows colder, sharper, carrying with it the low creak of branches swaying in the wind. The marsh darkens quickly. The crows take flight, black shapes vanishing into the deepening grey. The water reflects the dim light from the village, broken by ripples that spread in slow circles. A thin line of mist rises again from its surface, moving like breath. Somewhere within it comes a faint sound, not quite voice, not quite wind. It fades quickly, swallowed by distance, leaving only the slow rustle of reeds. In the Widow Crane's house, the fire burns bright. Shadows move along the walls, stretched and bent by the flame. She sits by the hearth, her eyes fixed on the kettle hanging above the coals. Steam curls upward, carrying the scent of herbs and something metallic beneath. The cat sits beside her chair, tail flicking lazily. Now and then, she glances toward the window where the fog presses close, its pale folds lit faintly by the fire within. The night settles again. The bell in the meeting house remains silent, though a faint tremor runs through its rope as the wind passes. The houses of the village glow softly, their lights reflected in the wet stones of the road. From somewhere near the marsh comes the distant croak of a frog, then silence. The world seems to hold its breath, balanced between sleep and watchfulness. The minister writes by candlelight in his study, the tip of his quill scratching softly against the paper. The words are neat, measured, deliberate. He pauses often, staring at the flame before continuing. The ink shines wet in the low light. He writes of faith and of weakness, of temptation and vigilance, of signs seen and unseen. At the bottom of the page, his hand hesitates, and then he adds a single line in smaller letters. The widow's chimney burns too long. Outside, the fog thickens once more, climbing the walls and softening the shapes of the houses. The road glistens faintly under the moon, and the marsh hums quietly with unseen life. The pumpkins in the fields glow again, faintly, their hollow faces catching the light of distant lanterns. The air grows still. Somewhere a door closes with a dull thud, and the sound ripples outward, fading into the night. Within the widow's cottage, the candle flickers low, its flame bending as though listening. She lifts her head slightly, her gaze steady on the window pane. The cat's ears twitch. Beyond the glass, the fog swirls, and a faint figure seems to pass. Slow, uncertain, almost human, but gone before shape can settle. The woman's eyes narrow, but she does not rise. She reaches instead for the small pouch hanging by the hearth, unties the string, and scatters a pinch of its contents into the fire. The flames flare briefly, filling the room with a sharp, clean scent. The cat settles again, its eyes half closed. The woman whispers something, a word meant only for the smoke, and the night continues its quiet watch. The marsh sighs softly in the distance, the water shifting against its banks. The wind carries the faintest trace of salt and earth. The bell above the meeting house stirs once, a single note barely audible, and the village holds still. The lanterns flicker, the chimneys breathe, and somewhere in the darkness unseen, the old fears begin to wake again. The air carries the faint scent of smoke and frost as dawn crawls once more over the edge of the fields. The light is dim, filtered through low grey clouds that seem to rest just above the trees. The marsh lies still, its surface smooth as slate, but farther inland, the land opens to wide, uneven acres scattered with the remains of the harvest. The pumpkin fields stretch far in every direction, their vines coiled and brittle, their leaves darkened and thin. What remains of the fruit gleams dull orange beneath a film of dew. The frost from the night has left a faint glaze over their skins, so that the light catches them faintly as the sun struggles through. The road that winds past them is quiet. A wagon stands abandoned near the fence line, its wheels sunk deep into the mud. The reins hang loose, the seat slick with moisture. A few crows pick through the stubble, hopping between the vines, their movements slow and watchful. The only sound is the faint creak of the fence as it leans under its own weight, the rope that once tied the posts together frayed and sagging with age. The villagers call this land the Hollow Acres. It has fed them for decades, its soil rich with the silt that drifts down each year from the marsh, but it carries a history older than their fences. The first settlers who claimed it built their homes near its edge, believing the high ground would keep them safe from the water's reach. They worked the soil with hands still blistered from their journey, cutting the land into narrow plots, each marked by stone and prayer. Over the years, the marsh crept closer. No one saw it happen, but each season the earth seemed softer, the air heavier, and the crops more stubborn to rise. Still they stayed, bound by the same stubborn faith that built every small village on this hard coast. Now, as autumn deepens, the hollow acres lie mostly untended. Only a few men come out this morning to gather what remains. Their movements are slow, deliberate, their breath visible in the cold. They carry baskets made from willow branches, their handles worn smooth by years of use. Each pumpkin they lift is turned carefully, inspected for rot, and placed gently atop the pile. The sound of their work, The scrape of boots in mud, the dull thump of fruit meeting wood, drifts faintly through the mist. None of them speak more than they must. A boy walks among them, no older than 14, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hair damp with dew. His father works a few rows away, head bent, hands moving steadily through the vines. The boy glances toward him now and then, careful not to fall behind. He pauses near one of the larger pumpkins, its stem thick and ridged, its colour deepened almost to red. For a moment, he sees something in its curve, a shadow, a glint, and bends closer. The surface is smooth but cold, colder than the air around it. He runs his palm over it, and the chill sinks quickly into his skin. When he pulls his hand away, a faint outline remains, as though the frost itself remembers his touch. He wipes it away quickly and moves on. The sun climbs higher, though its warmth never truly reaches the ground. The air remains sharp, the light pale and distant. From the hill beyond the fields, the meeting house bell glints faintly in the morning glare, unmoving but always visible, a reminder of order and faith. Its tower leans slightly east, the wood darkened by years of weather, and beneath it the small graveyard lies quiet, stones tilting at uneven angles, names softened by time. The fields stretch almost to its edge, the last rows of pumpkins ending just before the iron gate. By midday, the men rest. They sit on overturned baskets or fallen logs, unwrapping their meals with hands stiff from the cold. The bread is coarse, the cheese dry, but they eat without complaint. The boy sits apart, his back against a stone wall, chewing slowly while his gaze drifts across the fields. The wind moves through the vines, carrying with it a faint rustle that sounds almost like whispering. He turns his head, listening. The men nearby continue talking softly among themselves, their words lost in the distance. The sound returns again, faint and steady, like the brush of fabric or the low murmur of voices just beyond hearing. The boy sets down his bread. He stands, brushing dirt from his trousers, and steps lightly between the rows. The sound grows clearer as he moves. Not words, not exactly, but a pattern, a rhythm that makes his heart quicken. He stops near the centre of the field, where the ground dips slightly and the vines are thicker. Here, the pumpkins grow larger, the soil darker. He kneels, pressing his hand against the earth. It feels warmer than before, almost pulsing with the faint hum beneath it. He looks up quickly, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the rows, but the fields are empty. The wind stills. The sound fades. His father calls out to him from across the field, his voice sharp but not angry. The boy startles, stands quickly, and returns to the others. He says nothing about what he heard. That evening, as the light fades and the cold deepens, the men return to the village with their wagons full. The wheels creak over the stones, the oxen moving slowly, their breath steaming in the dim light. The pumpkins are stacked high, their shapes uneven against the grey sky. Some of the women wait by the road, shawls drawn close, ready to help unload the baskets. Their hands move quickly, steady, though their eyes glance often toward the dark fields behind the men. The sun is gone, leaving only a thin red line along the horizon. Once the wagons are emptied, the pumpkins are brought into the barns. Some will be kept for food, others hollowed for the night ahead. The work is steady and familiar, passed down through generations. But there is little laughter in it. The air inside the barns is heavy with the scent of earth and smoke. The light from the lanterns flickers over the walls, catching on the sharp edges of tools and the dark stains of old seasons. The sound of knives scraping against the tough rind echoes faintly, rhythmic and precise. The boy helps his father carve one of the larger pumpkins, their hands moving in practiced silence. His father's knife follows clean lines, cutting eyes narrow and straight, the mouth a single deep groove. He works with care, never lifting his gaze until the face is done. When the candle is placed inside and lit, the glow that spills out is uneven, wavering. The boy watches the light flicker across his father's features, softening them, making the shadows move. His father nods once, satisfied, and sets the pumpkin on the ground near the door. Its light stretches long across the barn floor, touching the boy's boots. As more pumpkins are lit, the barn fills with their dim, warm glow. Faces stare from every corner, some wide-eyed, some sharp and narrow, some smiling faintly, though none with joy. The men step back, wiping their hands, the smell of burnt wax rising as the candles flicker to life. The boy feels the air grow thicker, the smoke curling around his face. He blinks, and for a brief moment, it seems the carved faces move, the shadows bending behind the light as though they breathe. He looks away quickly. Outside, the wind shifts again, sweeping through the fields and carrying with it the faint rustle of vines. The moon climbs slow and pale above the trees, its light cold and distant against the warm glow of the lanterns. From the edge of the marsh, a single frog croaks, answered by another somewhere deeper in the reeds. The sound travels across the fields like an echo of something older than the village itself. Inside one of the houses near the square, a woman prepares her hearth for the night. She places a carved pumpkin near the door, its face simple, its flame steady. Her daughter watches from the table, chin resting in her hands. The woman adjusts the candle's position until the light shines evenly, then steps back. It keeps the wandering souls from entering, she says softly, though not to the child, more to the silence itself, as if reminding it of a rule. The girl nods, though she does not understand. She watches the face flicker, the shadows dance across the floor, and wonders why the eyes always seem to follow her. In another house, the minister's wife lights the final candle in her window. She glances once toward the marsh, where the fog has already begun to form again. The line of trees there fades into the grey, the ground below it soft and gleaming with moisture. She closes the shutters carefully, then kneels to pray. Her words are quiet, spoken quickly, as if afraid to linger on any one thought. When she finishes, she remains still for a long while, listening to the faint crackle of the fire and the soft hiss of the wind outside. The night deepens. The fields lie quiet once more, their rows of pumpkins glowing faintly in the distance like scattered embers. The air hums with the faint sound of insects, the occasional creak of wood as it cools, the low murmur of distant water. From somewhere near the marsh comes a faint light, not a lantern, not quite fire, but something small and steady that moves slowly across the surface before fading. The mist thickens, swallowing the shape of the land until only the faint glows remain, floating in the dark like watchful eyes. The boy cannot sleep. He lies in his small bed beneath the slanted roof, the blanket pulled high to his chin. The sound of the wind outside seems louder now, carrying the faint whistle of air through the cracks in the wall. He stares at the ceiling, tracing the knots in the wood. Every few moments, he thinks he hears movement from the yard. A creak, a soft thud, something dragging faintly over the ground. He tells himself it's the wind, the oxen shifting in their stalls, the loose shutters tapping against the frame. But then comes another sound, lower, closer, a whisper, so faint he almost believes it's inside his head. He holds his breath, listening. It comes again, barely formed. A breath of sound that seems to move along the walls, curling through the air like smoke. He can't make out the words, only the rhythm, soft and even. He turns toward the window, where a faint orange light glows through the cracks of the shutter. The pumpkin his father carved sits just beyond it, its flame flickering. For a moment, he imagines the whisper coming from there, from that hollow face burning quietly in the dark. He closes his eyes and pulls the blanket tighter. In the morning, the air smells of damp ash. The candles have burned down to stubs, the wax pooled and hardened. The pumpkins that glowed through the night now look dull, their faces sagging slightly, the edges darkened with soot. The men go about their work without speaking of what they've seen or heard, though more than one glances toward the marsh before returning to his labour. The boy helps gather the remains of the burned candles, his fingers sticky with wax. When he reaches for the one near the door, he notices a faint mark on the pumpkin's surface, just above the carved mouth, a thin, pale line that wasn't there before. It curves slightly, like the trace of a finger drawn through frost. He wipes at it, but it does not fade. The fog lingers longer than usual that day. The fields stay damp, the air thick and unmoving. The villagers keep close to their homes, the children told to stay near the fire. The minister's wife keeps her shutters closed, though it is still daylight, and even the widow Crane does not leave her house. The pumpkins in the fields lie heavy and still, their hollow faces faintly smudged with soot, their candles long gone cold. Yet when the wind moves through the vines, it carries again that same soft rustle, the sound that seems almost like whispering, a sound too old to belong to any living tongue. And as the grey light deepens toward evening once more, the villagers glance toward the horizon, where the marsh meets the sky, and though none speak of it aloud, each feels the same thought forming quiet and unspoken, that something ancient, long buried beneath the soil and silence, has begun to stir again beneath the whispering fields. The church stands at the crest of the hill where the land rises just enough to look down on the marsh. From a distance, it seems larger than it truly is, a narrow building of pale boards and dark trim, the steeple reaching into the grey sky like a finger pointing heavenward. The bell above it catches the light now and then, a dull glint of metal half hidden by weather and moss. The ground around the church is uneven, scattered with stones and low shrubs. Beyond it, the graveyard stretches down the slope, the headstones crooked, their edges softened by decades of wind and rain. The path leading up is rough, made of packed dirt and loose gravel, worn deep by the boots of every man, woman and child who has passed through its doors since the village was built. The air smells faintly of salt from the marsh, mixed with the sharper scent of wood smoke rising from chimneys below. The fields are still visible in the distance, though the fog lingers above them like a low ceiling. The pumpkins lie scattered, their dull orange shells half sunk in the soil. Crows gather on the fence rails, black shapes against the pale light, watching the road as if waiting for someone to arrive. Inside, the church is dim even at midday. The windows are narrow, their glass clouded with age. The light that filters through is pale and uneven, catching the dust that hangs in the air. The wooden floor creaks with every step. The benches, built from local pine, have been scrubbed smooth by generations of hands and knees. The air holds the faint smell of wax and old paper. At the far end stands the pulpit, raised above the floor by a few steps, its edge polished from the touch of the minister's hands. Behind it hangs a single wooden cross, simple, unadorned, its surface darkened by the years. The minister stands alone at the pulpit. His Bible lies open before him, though his eyes do not move across the page. His lips move without sound, his gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the candle's flame. The light trembles slightly, as though disturbed by breath, but the air is still. The faint sound of wind outside seeps through the cracks in the boards. A slow, steady sigh that seems to circle the building before fading. He closes the book softly and sets his hands flat on the wood, feeling the grain beneath his palms. The surface is cold. He has been preaching here for nearly 20 years, through every winter, through every drought, through every fever that's passed through the village. His sermons have grown slower with time, his words heavier, but his voice still holds authority. The people listen, even when they don't understand. Fear has a way of keeping its own congregation. Yet lately, when he speaks, he feels the silence that follows longer than it should be. Not reverence, but something closer to doubt. He can feel it in the stillness of the pews, in the way eyes drift toward the door before the last prayer is finished. The bell above him gives a faint tremor. He looks up. The rope beside the pulpit sways slightly, though no hand has touched it. The wind, perhaps, or something else. He watches it for a moment longer, then turns away. The door at the back of the church opens, letting in a shaft of light that falls across the floor. A woman steps inside, her shawl drawn close. Her face is lined, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. She walks slowly up the aisle, each step careful on the creaking boards. The minister nods once as she approaches. "You shouldn't be out alone," he says softly. She stops near the front pew, setting her hands on the back of the bench. "I couldn't sleep," she replies. "The fog hasn't lifted since yesterday. The air feels wrong." He glances toward the windows. The season's changing. The cold does that. It unsettles the ground, makes the air thick. She shakes her head. It isn't the cold. It's something in it. Something that watches. Her voice lowers, almost a whisper. "Last night I heard footsteps behind my house. I looked, but there was nothing. Just fog." The minister studies her face for a long moment, then sighs. "You mustn't listen to the whispers of the night, Mrs. Elkins. The wind carries many voices, and none of them mean what they seem." Her fingers tighten on the wood. "And if it wasn't the wind?" He says nothing for a moment, then closes the Bible and takes a step down from the pulpit. "Then it is our duty to pray all the harder." She looks at him, her expression unreadable, then nods once and turns away. As she reaches the door, he calls after her. "Keep your lantern lit tonight, and if you hear voices again, speak no word back to them." She hesitates at the threshold. "You think it listens?" He does not answer. When she leaves, the church falls silent again. The light through the windows has dimmed, though the clouds have not thickened. The minister walks slowly down the aisle, his hand brushing the tops of the benches as he passes. He stops near the last row, where the boards of the floor are darker than the rest. A faint chill rises there, one that doesn't come from the open door. He crouches slightly, pressing his fingers to the wood. It feels damp, almost as though water seeps up from below. He withdraws his hand and wipes it absently on his coat. Outside, the wind has picked up. The bell sways gently, the metal groaning in its cradle. A few villagers walk the path below, their figures small against the pale sky. The minister watches them from the doorway, his eyes lingering on the woman's shawl as it disappears among the houses. The marsh lies beyond, motionless, but for the slow movement of fog across its surface, It seems to breathe in rhythm with the air, rising and falling, as though the land itself were alive. As afternoon fades, the village gathers for worship. The benches fill slowly, the air growing heavy with the mingled scent of wool and cold earth. The candles burn low along the walls, their light unsteady. The minister begins to speak, his voice measured, his words drawn from the familiar passages. He talks of vigilance, of faith against darkness, of the trials that test the soul. The people bow their heads, their hands folded tight. Yet as the sermon continues, he feels the weight of their attention falter. Some shift in their seats, others glance toward the windows where the light has turned grey. He speaks louder, his voice firm, almost sharp. Temptation hides in the ordinary, he says. The devil does not come with fire and thunder. He comes with whispers, with small doubts that creep through the cracks of the heart. A murmur moves through the crowd, a sound not of agreement, but of unease. Someone coughs. The minister pauses, his gaze sweeping the room. The shadows at the edges of the pews seem deeper now, the candlelight too weak to reach them fully. He can just make out the shape of faces half hidden, the glint of eyes in the dim. He lowers his tone, slower, quieter. Fear gives him strength, but faith. He stops. A sound comes from the back of the church. A faint creak, the door shifting against its latch. The congregation turns slightly, a wave of movement passing through them. The sound stops. The minister steadies himself, clears his throat, and finishes. Faith denies him his hold. The final hymn is sung softly, voices blending in tired harmony. When it ends, the congregation files out quickly, their footsteps echoing across the floor. The minister remains behind, his eyes on the cross above the pulpit. The air feels heavier than before, the shadows thicker. He moves toward the back of the church, stopping where the door had creaked. The latch hangs loose, though it had been fastened that morning. He reaches out and presses it closed. Night falls fast. The road down the hill glistens faintly in the moonlight, the stones wet from a fine mist that has begun to settle again. The minister walks slowly toward his home, the sound of his boots dull against the damp earth. From the graveyard beside the church comes the faint rustle of wind through grass. The headstones gleam pale in the moonlight, their carvings half erased. A single candle burns near one of them, its flame bent low but steady. Someone has been here recently, though the path shows no fresh footprints. At the foot of the hill, the road forks. To the left lies the village square, to the right, the marsh. The minister stops at the crossing. The fog has crept in from the water, rolling low and thick across the ground. He can hear the faint lap of water against the reeds, though the surface is hidden. He turns toward the village, but before he takes a step, he hears something, a faint hollow sound, like the echo of a voice carried on the wind. It is soft, almost gentle, a whisper that seems to come from the direction of the church behind him. He turns, but the hill is empty. The bell tower stands motionless, its outline pale against the sky. The whisper fades, replaced by silence. When he reaches his home, he finds his wife waiting by the hearth, her expression tense. "You were long at the church," she says, though not as a question. "There was much to see to," he replies, removing his coat. She nods, glancing toward the window. The fog presses thick against the glass, its surface beaded with moisture. "The fields are strange tonight," she says quietly. "The pumpkins still burn. The air looks alive with them." He follows her gaze. From here, through the thin curtain, He can just make out the faint orange glow scattered across the fields beyond the marsh. It trembles, shifting as the fog moves. He says nothing, only turns back to the fire. They eat in silence. The sound of the wind outside grows louder, rattling the shutters. The flames in the hearth bend and steady, bending again as though in rhythm with some slow, unseen breath. The minister sets down his spoon, staring into the fire. "Did you hear anything?" he asks at last. His wife looks up. "When?" "At service, when the hymn ended." She frowns. "Only the hymn itself." He nods slowly. "It wasn't the wind." She watches him, waiting for more, but he doesn't continue. The fire crackles softly. The smell of burning oak fills the room. Later, when the house has grown quiet, the minister walks once more to the window. The fog has thickened to a wall of white. The lantern by the door burns faintly, its light swallowed almost at once. He stares into it until his reflection fades, replaced by the faint impression of something else. A shape behind the fog, barely visible, standing still at the edge of the light. He blinks, and it's gone. He steps back, his breath fogging the glass. For a moment he feels the urge to open the door, to step outside and see what lies beyond, but he does not move. Instead, he turns away and kneels beside the bed. His voice, when it comes, is barely more than a whisper. Outside, the bell trembles again, though no hand draws it. The sound drifts down over the village, soft but steady, like a warning given too late. The pumpkins in the fields flicker faintly, their lights dimming one by one as the fog rolls over them, until only a few remain. Small, unsteady fires scattered across the hollow land beneath the watching church. And as the last of the light fades, the wind carries again that low, restless sound from the marsh. Not quite voice, not quite breath, threading through the night like a memory that refuses to die. The fog began to thin by the second morning, though it never truly lifted. It left behind a wetness that clung to every surface, the walls of the houses, the wooden rails of the fences, the dry grass that bent under its own weight. The sky had turned pale, colourless, the kind of grey that seemed to leach the warmth from anything beneath it. The church bell remained silent, though those who passed near the hill said they could feel a faint vibration in the air, as though the metal still hummed softly long after the sound had died. The road that wound from the church led upward beyond the village, curling between the thinning trees until it reached the bare rise known to everyone, whether they spoke its name aloud or not. Gallows Hill. It had stood there before the town was founded, before the first fences were laid, before the meeting house was built. The old trees at its crest were black and bent, their limbs gnarled from years of wind. No one went there after dark, and few in daylight. The soil was dry, even in rain, and the grass that grew there was thin and yellow. At the edge of the hill stood the remains of a wooden frame, long since broken by weather. The beam that had once stretched across its top had fallen, half buried in the earth. The posts that remained leaned at odd angles, their surfaces scarred and splintered. The rope was gone, but those who had lived long enough remembered when it still hung there, swaying in the breeze that came down from the marsh. On certain nights, when the moon was low and the wind carried the scent of salt, people said they could still see it, a dark shape moving against the pale sky, swinging gently, soundless. Others said it was only the trees, the illusion of branches bending in the fog. Yet even those who scoffed at such tales avoided the hill after sunset. The widow Crane lived not far from there, in a cottage half hidden by birch trees. Her home was small, built of rough planks, the roof patched with sod and moss. The smoke from her chimney rose straight into the still air, thin and pale. The path to her door was narrow and overgrown, though well worn by her own footsteps. Few others ever used it. She woke early, as she always did, before the first light reached the horizon. The fire from the night before still smouldered in the hearth, casting faint orange light across the floor. Her cat stretched near the coals, its black fur gleaming in the glow. She moved quietly, her motions measured, stirring the embers, adding kindling, boiling water in the small iron pot that hung above the fire. The sound of it filled the silence of the room, soft and steady. When she stepped outside, the cold met her at once. The mist lingered low among the trees, curling around her ankles as she walked. The ground beneath her feet was hard, the frost holding firm in the shadows. She carried a bundle of dried herbs wrapped in linen, tied with a strip of red thread. At the foot of the hill she paused. The air here always felt different, thinner, sharper, as though each breath carried the weight of memory. She knelt beside a flat stone half covered with lichen and placed the bundle upon it. Her fingers lingered on the stone's surface, tracing the grooves worn deep into its face. Then she whispered something low, almost inaudible, before rising and turning back toward her house. The villagers had their stories about her, each more certain than the last. Some said she came from the north, from a settlement that no longer existed. Others claimed she had been here since before the town was built, her age impossible to tell. Children whispered that she could see through walls, that she spoke to things that lived beneath the marsh water, that the crows outside her window were her familiars. Their parents scolded them for repeating such tales, but they never told them they were wrong. A few still went to her in secret. When a child's fever rose too high, when the cow gave sour milk, when a man's dreams grew heavy with shapes he couldn't name, they came to her door after dusk and left before dawn. She would take what they brought, a jar of honey, a piece of bread, a small coin, and in return she gave them a salve, a charm, or a handful of herbs wrapped in cloth. Most said the cures worked. None ever thanked her twice. One evening, a knock came at her door. The sound was hesitant, soft. She opened it without speaking. A woman stood outside, her shawl pulled tight, her face pale in the moonlight. In her arms she carried a small bundle. The child inside it did not stir. The widow stepped aside, letting her in. The firelight revealed the woman's face, Mrs. Elkins, the same who had spoken to the minister days before. Her eyes were red from crying, her hands trembling as she held the child close. "He hasn't woken since yesterday," she said, her voice breaking. "He was fine, then he started to shake, and now—" She stopped, her breath catching. The widow said nothing. She took the bundle gently, unwrapping it with care. The child's skin was pale, damp with sweat, his lips tinged faintly blue. His chest rose and fell shallowly, the breath almost invisible. The widow touched his forehead, then his wrist, her fingers cool and steady. She looked toward the fire, then back at the woman. "You waited too long," she said quietly. Mrs. Elkins shook her head. "I prayed. I went to the minister. He told me to wait on God's mercy." The widow's expression did not change. "And did mercy come?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Please," she whispered. The widow moved to her shelves, selecting a small jar and a handful of dried leaves. She ground them together in a bowl, adding water from the pot until the mixture turned dark. The smell was sharp and bitter. She dipped a cloth into it and pressed it gently against the child's chest. His body jerked once, then stilled. The widow's hand did not waver, Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the hiss of the fire. Then the child gasped. A small, sudden sound, thin as a breath through straw. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Mrs. Elkins cried out softly, reaching for him. The widow handed the child back, her face unreadable. "He'll wake again by morning," she said. "Keep him near the fire. Don't let him sleep too deeply tonight." Mrs. Elkins clutched the child, her sobs quiet but unrestrained. "How can I thank you?" she asked. The widow turned away. "Don't," she said. "And don't speak of this to anyone." When the door closed, the wind outside had changed direction. It came low across the hill, bending the grass flat. The moon was half hidden behind the clouds, and the broken frame of the gallows cast its shadow long across the ground. By morning, word had spread. Not that the child had recovered, but that the widow's house had been seen burning bright through the night, its windows glowing red, though no smoke had risen. Some said they heard voices from the hill, a woman's and a man's, calling back and forth until dawn. Others swore the bell in the church had trembled once, faintly, though no wind had stirred. The minister said nothing publicly, but his expression grew darker in the days that followed. He spoke longer in his sermons, his voice sharper. He warned of false miracles, of the danger of faith misplaced. He did not name her, but everyone knew. The widow kept to herself. The people who had once come to her door stopped. The path to her house grew over with grass. Only the crows remained, their black shapes moving restlessly between the trees near her roof. At night, their cries carried across the fields, low and ragged, until the dogs began to bark in answer. One night, the minister came to her himself. He did not announce his arrival. The sound of his boots on the path was the only warning she had. She was sitting by the hearth, sewing a tear in her shawl, when the knock came. She did not look up at first, only said, "You took long enough." He opened the door without waiting for her to bid him in. The air behind him was cold, and the fog clung to his coat like wet smoke. He stood just inside, his hat in his hand, his face shadowed by the firelight. "You know why I'm here," he said. She nodded once. "You think I've sinned. I think you've forgotten who holds the power to heal and who does not." Her eyes flicked to the fire. "If I'd waited on your mercy, the boy would be buried by now." His jaw tightened. "You speak as though you command the will of God." She looked at him steadily. "No, only what the earth gives." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The people are afraid. You've kept them in fear for too long. It must end." The widow set down her needle and thread. "It isn't me they fear." For a moment neither spoke. The fire crackled softly between them. Then the minister turned sharply and left, the door slamming behind him. The sound echoed across the hill, carrying through the fog until it faded into silence. That night, the wind came from the east. The air grew heavy, thick with moisture. The crows were silent. The light in the widow's window burned late, the small flame bending low again and again, as though something unseen passed before it. By dawn, the sky had turned the colour of iron. The village stirred early. Men gathered near the meeting house, their faces drawn, their voices low. The minister stood among them, his coat buttoned high, his eyes fixed on the hill. The fog had thinned just enough to show the faint outline of the broken gallows and, near it, the dark shape of the widow's cottage. They climbed the hill in silence, their boots crunching on the frozen grass. When they reached the house, the door stood open. The fire inside had burned out, leaving only grey ash. The chair near the hearth lay tipped over, the floor scattered with herbs and broken glass. The cat was gone. Of the widow, there was no sign. They searched the hill, the edge of the marsh, the path toward the woods. Nothing. Only the faint impression of footprints near the stone at the base of the gallows. One set leading toward it, none leading away. By evening, the fog returned, thicker than before. The villagers said little. The minister stood on the hill until night fell, his breath visible in the cold air, his eyes fixed on the dark frame that loomed above him. When he finally turned back toward the village, the first snow of the season began to fall. Light, slow, soundless. In the days that followed, no one spoke her name. The path to her house was left untended, the windows boarded. The gallows on the hill remained, its shadow stretching long across the frozen ground. The crows returned, perching on its beam, their cries echoing through the still air. And sometimes, when the fog drifted low and the wind carried the scent of herbs and ash, those who passed near the hill swore they heard the sound of footsteps, slow, steady, coming from the place where the widow had last stood. The church bell stayed silent for 3 weeks. Then, one night near the end of November, it rang once. A single hollow note that rolled through the fog and across the fields, fading only when it reached the marsh. No one claimed to have rung it. And by morning, a thin bundle of dried herbs, bound with red thread, had appeared on the minister's doorstep. He did not touch it. He closed the door and prayed until dawn. Snow clung to the rooftops now, thin at first, then thicker as the days shortened. The air had turned brittle, the kind of cold that crept into the walls and stayed there, no matter how large the fire burned. The fields lay bare, the last of the pumpkins gathered or left to sink into the frost. The marsh froze in places, the surface dull and white, though the water beneath still moved, slow and patient. The hill stood unchanged, the gallows black against the pale sky. In the village, the rhythm of life narrowed to the space between hearth and door. Smoke rose steadily from chimneys, drifting low before vanishing into the grey. Children stayed indoors, their play muffled by the thick silence that came with the cold. Men repaired tools, mended fences, chopped wood. The women cooked in iron pots, their sleeves rolled, their movements methodical. Each day folded quietly into the next. The minister had grown older in the span of weeks. The lines around his mouth had deepened, his gaze more distant. He spoke less in public, keeping mostly to his study. His sermons were shorter now, but his prayers longer. The congregation did not question it. They too were weary. Whatever had happened on the hill was not spoken of, yet the air held its memory, a heaviness that lingered in the breath of every house, in the shadows that stretched long after dusk. At night, when the wind came from the north, the fires in the hearths bent low. Sparks drifted upward, turning to ash before reaching the chimney's mouth. People learned to watch the flames, not for warmth, but for warning. A steady fire meant safety. A sudden flicker, a hiss, or a gust that made the light shudder. Those were signs to whisper a prayer, to cross the hearth with salt, to set the poker upright before sleep. The minister's wife kept the fire alive through every night. She woke often to feed it, adding small pieces of wood, never letting it die. Sometimes she thought she heard movement outside. The faint crunch of snow, the sound of something brushing against the shutters. But when she looked, the yard was empty. Only the footprints of the night's first snow showed, and even they began to fade by dawn. Inside their house, the walls held the smell of smoke and old paper. Books lined the shelves, their bindings cracked, their pages yellowed from the damp. The Bible lay open on the table, its ink smudged by the heat. A single candle burned beside it, the wax pooled around its base. The minister sat there long after midnight most nights, his quill unmoving, his gaze fixed on the flame. He had begun to write again, not sermons, not prayers, but something else. Pages filled with half-sentences, thoughts cut short, names written and crossed out. The sound of the pen against the paper was the only thing that kept the silence from closing in entirely. He wrote of faith, of sin, of the burden of belief. He wrote of fear that disguised itself as piety, of mercy withheld and guilt that grew like rot beneath the skin. He did not name the widow, but her absence haunted every line. Once, when the wind rose hard against the house, he stopped writing and listened. Through the walls came the faint crackle of the fire, the distant groan of wood expanding in the cold. Then, softly, another sound, like footsteps on the roof, slow and even. He held his breath. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began. He stared at the ceiling until the candle burned low, the wick collapsing into a pool of molten wax. In the morning, a thin layer of ash had settled across the floorboards near the hearth, though the chimney had not drawn smoke since dawn. The air smelled faintly of burned herbs. He brushed it away without speaking of it to his wife. The days passed like this, slow and without measure. The snow deepened. The sky hung low, and the village seemed to shrink beneath its own silence. Yet now and then, something shifted. Small things, easily dismissed, but not easily forgotten. The bell above the church gave a single note without wind. The firewood stacked outside the meeting house fell in the night, though no one had touched it. A cross etched into a doorframe appeared faintly scorched, as though burned there from within the wood itself. The people said nothing aloud, but their glances grew sharper, their greetings shorter. They avoided the road to the hill, though no one gave the order. The marsh froze completely by midwinter, its surface covered in ice clear enough to see the dark water below. Children threw stones across it and watched them slide without sound until they vanished into the fog that always lingered at its far edge. The minister's wife began to notice her husband's hands tremble when he wrote. His sleep grew restless, broken by sudden starts. Once, he woke before dawn and stood by the window, staring toward the church until the horizon turned faintly blue. When she asked what he saw, he said only, "The fog is rising again." That same day, she went to visit Mrs. Elkins, bringing bread wrapped in cloth. The air was brittle, the snow hard underfoot. The path to the Elkins house passed near the edge of the fields, where the last of the pumpkins still lay buried under frost. Their shapes were barely visible, dull mounds against the snow. As she passed, a crow flew overhead, cawing once before landing on a fence post. Its feathers shone blue-black in the light. She watched it a moment before moving on. Mrs. Elkins opened her door quickly when she heard the knock. The smell of broth and smoke drifted out into the cold. The child, once fevered, now sat near the hearth, his cheeks flushed, his eyes bright. He smiled faintly when the minister's wife entered. "He's well," Mrs. Elkins said, her tone both grateful and guarded. The minister's wife nodded. "I'm glad, truly." Mrs. Elkins looked away, stirring the pot on the fire. "Some things don't leave easy," she murmured. "He still talks in his sleep, says her name sometimes." The minister's wife felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "Her name?" Mrs. Elkins hesitated, then shook her head. "It could be anyone. The wind carries voices in this weather." They sat together for a while, eating bread and broth, their words few. When the minister's wife finally rose to leave, Mrs. Elkins followed her to the door. "Tell him," she said quietly. "Tell your husband not to go to the hill again." She paused. "He hasn't." "He will." That night, the wind returned from the east. The snow fell heavier, soft flakes that muffled every sound. The church stood half buried, its steps covered. The path to its door vanished beneath drifts. Yet a light burned in the window of the study above, faint but steady. The minister had returned there after supper, unable to rest. The candle flame threw long shadows across the pages before him. His pen moved slowly, the words uneven. He wrote of judgment, of forgiveness, of a fire that consumes without heat. His handwriting grew darker as he went, the ink pooling where his hand trembled. Then the quill stopped. He stared at the line he had written last. The fire remembers what the flesh forgets. The words hung before him like a confession. He set the pen aside, closed the book, and rose. The air in the room had grown colder, though the fire in the hearth burned bright. He walked to it, kneeling to add another log, and paused. Beneath the wood lay a single strip of cloth, half burned, the thread still visible at its edge. Red, twisted, the same kind that bound the widow's herbs. He touched it lightly with the poker, and it crumbled into ash. He did not speak for a long time. The flames hissed, shrinking slightly, then grew again. The sound of the wind outside faded. In the stillness that followed, he heard faintly, or thought he did, a woman's voice, low and distant, as if carried from far off through the walls. It was not clear, not pleading or angry, just there. The tone was steady, almost patient, the way one speaks to someone who refuses to listen. He rose quickly, crossing to the window. The glass was fogged with moisture, the reflection of the fire flickering across its surface. Beyond it, only white, snow and fog blending into one unbroken expanse. He stayed there until the candle burned out. The next morning, ash covered the hearth again, thicker this time, a thin grey layer that stretched across the floorboards near the table. When he brushed it away, he found faint marks beneath it, shaped like the impression of fingertips. He knelt, running his own hand over the spot, but the wood was smooth. Only the pattern remained, faint as breath on glass. He told no one. The weeks passed. The snow melted, froze again, melted once more. The marsh thawed slowly, the water beneath moving with a dull sound like distant breathing. The first birds returned, their cries sharp in the thin air. The fields remained empty. When the thaw was complete, the villagers began to clear the fallen branches, to repair the fences, to bring life back to the soil. The minister walked among them, his presence quiet but constant. He spoke kindly, though his eyes seemed always elsewhere, fixed on something just beyond the horizon. The people greeted him politely, but with unease. They had noticed the change, not in his words, but in the way he carried silence with him wherever he went. On the first clear evening of March, he lit a small fire behind the church. The villagers watched from a distance as he carried out the old wood from the pews that had rotted during the winter. He stacked them carefully, feeding the flames until they burned bright and steady. When the fire reached its height, he stepped back, watching as the smoke rose straight into the still air. One of the men approached, hesitant. "Should we say a prayer?" The minister shook his head. "No prayer tonight," he said quietly. "Only silence." The man nodded and retreated. The fire burned long into the night, its light visible across the marsh. When at last it faded, only embers remained, glowing red against the dark earth. The minister stood over them, unmoving, until the last spark died. He turned then, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the fog, a woman, small, her shawl drawn close, watching. He did not move toward her. He only stood and waited. The shape remained motionless until the wind shifted, stirring the ash, and when it cleared, she was gone. By morning, the ground where the fire had burned was black and smooth, as though no wood had ever been there. The people of the village avoided the spot. The minister said nothing about what he had seen. But that night, when he returned home, his wife found him kneeling by the hearth, the fire cold, the ashes scattered. His hands were grey to the wrist, his eyes fixed on the embers as though expecting them to breathe again. The next day, he preached once more. His voice was calm, steady, his words deliberate. He spoke of renewal, of ashes that make the soil fertile again, of forgiveness that comes not from forgetting, but from remembering. The congregation listened in silence. No one looked toward the hill, though every person there thought of it. That night, as the last of the snow melted from the roof and the wind changed to a softer current from the south, the village settled under the faint sound of running water. The marsh sighed quietly. The fires burned low in every hearth. The ashes in the minister's grate shifted once, sending up a single spark that hung in the air before fading. Somewhere beyond the church, where the fog began to gather again, a crow called, one long, low cry that carried across the empty fields and over the sleeping houses until it vanished into the trees at the base of the hill. And when the dawn came grey and slow, the smell of smoke still lingered faintly, as though the fires of the night before had left behind something that refused to die. The thaw had left the roads soft and uneven. Deep ruts filled with brown water, and the stones that lined the paths had sunk half into the mud. The air carried the scent of wet soil and wood smoke. The trees along the edge of the village had begun to show the faintest buds, though the branches still looked brittle in the cold. It was early April, the time when winter loosened its hold, but spring had not yet taken root. The fields were bare except for the black remains of old vines curling low against the earth. At the edge of the village, two roads met where the ground dipped slightly before rising toward the hill. The crossroads had always been there, older than the fences, older even than the church. No one remembered who first cut the paths that met at that angle, one leading east toward the marsh, the other west toward the deeper woods. In summer, the grass grew high around the stones there, hiding the hollow at its centre. In winter, the snow drifted there last. A lantern stood at the crossing, a wooden post with a small iron hook at its top, from which hung a glass lamp blackened with soot. The wick inside had burned through and been replaced many times over the years. It was said the lantern had once been a guide for travellers passing between villages, a comfort against the dark. But few travelled now. The roads beyond the marsh had grown impassable, and the forest to the west swallowed its own paths. Still, the lantern was kept lit each night. The task fell to the children, one at a time, chosen by the minister at Sunday service. That week, it was given to a boy named Samuel Price. He was 12 years old, tall for his age, with dark hair that curled when damp. His father was away trading saltfish along the coast, and his mother worked in the weaver's loft by the square. He took the duty quietly, proud but uneasy. It was said that tending the lantern brought luck, but only if one lit it before the first star appeared. If the light came late, the road itself remembered, and the night kept your name. He left each evening at dusk, carrying a small clay pot with a thin rope handle. Inside it, the The candle stub rattled softly against the metal striker. His mother walked him to the edge of the lane the first night and told him not to linger. "Go straight there and straight home," she said. "Don't stop to look into the fields." He nodded. The air was cold enough to make his breath visible. He tightened his scarf and started down the path. The road curved gently through the low land. The fields to either side were still damp from the melt, patches of fog lying low over the soil. The last of the light faded slowly, the sky turning a pale silver blue. The sound of water dripping from the branches filled the air, steady as a heartbeat. He walked quickly, keeping his eyes on the faint glow of the lantern ahead, though it was dark still. When he reached it, he stopped. The post leaned slightly, its wood rough beneath his palm. The glass of the lantern was cold, the inside blackened with old smoke. He opened it carefully, placed the candle inside, and struck the flint against the metal. The spark caught on the third try, flaring bright before settling into a small, steady flame. The light flickered against the fog, casting thin shadows across the road. He watched it for a moment, the quiet of the place pressing in around him. The fields were silent, the trees unmoving. Only the faint sound of his own breath filled the air. He turned to go, but paused when he saw movement in the fog ahead, a figure crossing slowly from one side of the road to the other. It was too far to see clearly, only a darker shape against the grey. It moved without sound, its pace even. When it reached the far side, it stopped, then turned its head slightly as if looking back. Samuel froze. The figure didn't move again. He blinked once, and it was gone. He ran home without looking back. His mother said nothing when he told her, only crossed herself once and checked the window latch before putting him to bed. The next morning, when he passed the crossroads on his way to fetch water, the lantern still burned faintly, though the wick had burned through hours ago. The glass was clean, the soot gone. That evening, when the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the road, he went again. The fog was thicker than before, rising from the marsh like breath. He carried the clay pot close to his chest, the metal handle cool against his fingers. The wind had changed direction, coming now from the east, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic beneath it. He reached the crossroads as the first stars began to appear and lit the lantern quickly. The flame flared and steadied. He turned to leave, then stopped. A sound came from behind him, soft, deliberate, the crunch of footsteps in the wet gravel. He turned sharply, the clay pot swinging against his leg. The road behind him was empty. The fog had thickened, curling low around his boots. The sound came again, closer this time. He took a step back, his heart hammering. "Who's there?" His voice sounded thin in the open air. No answer. He could see only the faint glow of the lantern reflected in the mist. The silence that followed was complete, too complete. No wind, no rustle, not even the usual creak of wood or distant barking of dogs from the village. He backed toward the post, keeping his eyes on the road. The air felt heavier, pressing against his chest. Then the sound came again, off to his right, slower now, like the drag of something along the ground. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The light of the lantern wavered slightly, as if stirred by unseen breath. He stared into the fog, waiting for shape, for sound, for something he could name. Then, faintly, he heard a whisper, a woman's voice, low, almost kind. The words were indistinct, carried away by the wind before they reached him. He turned and ran, not stopping until the lights of the village came into view. When he told his mother, she said nothing at first. Then she went to the cupboard, took down a small pouch, and handed it to him. "Salt," she said. "Keep it in your pocket. Don't speak if you hear her again." "Who?" he asked. But she only shook her head. For the next 3 nights, he lit the lantern without incident. The fog came and went. The wind shifted, but nothing stirred near the crossroads. He began to think he'd imagined it. The fields stayed quiet, the trees still. Even the minister's sermons grew lighter as the weather softened. The villagers worked longer hours repairing fences, cutting new furrows into the thawed soil. Life returned, slow and steady. Then, on the 5th night, the air changed. The wind rose just after sunset, sharp and dry, carrying with it the smell of smoke. Samuel stepped outside and saw that the sky above the marsh glowed faintly orange, as though something burned far away beyond the water. The dogs in the village barked in the same direction, their voices overlapping. His mother watched from the doorway, her shawl tight around her shoulders. "Light it quickly tonight," she said, "and don't look toward the marsh." He nodded, clutching the clay pot, and set off down the road. The wind pushed against him, cold and biting. The fog had thickened again, rolling low and fast, blurring the edges of the fences. When he reached the crossroads, the smell of smoke was stronger, but there was no fire in sight, only that distant glow that pulsed like heat lightning. He opened the lantern and struck the flint. The first spark died. The second caught, flaring too bright before fading. On the third, the wick took, the flame steady. He set the glass down carefully, the light reflecting in his eyes. For a moment, it seemed the fog recoiled from the glow, retreating just far enough to reveal the fork in the road more clearly. Something moved at the edge of the field. He turned, holding the lantern up. A figure stood near the old stone wall, barely visible through the haze. A woman, small, her shoulders hunched beneath a dark shawl. She faced him, though her face was hidden by shadow. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she lifted her hand slightly, as if to beckon. Samuel's mouth went dry. He remembered his mother's words and kept silent. The woman lowered her hand, tilting her head slightly, her movements slow and deliberate. The fog swirled around her feet, curling upward. She took one step forward, and the flame in the lantern flickered. Another step, and the air grew colder. Samuel took a step back, clutching the salt in his pocket. He closed his eyes and began to walk backward, one slow step at a time, never turning. When he finally opened them again, the road behind him glowed faintly with the light from the lantern, but the woman was gone. Only the faint sound of wind moved through the field. He ran the rest of the way home. That night, the wind howled against the roofs, and the smell of smoke grew stronger. The villagers woke to find a thin haze drifting through the streets. No fire burned in the fields, no embers glowed, yet the air was heavy with ash. The minister stepped outside before dawn and found the snow around the church dusted with fine grey powder. When he touched it, it smeared like soot. By midday, the haze had lifted. The crossroads lantern still burned, though no one had tended it since sunset. The wick was long gone, the glass cold, yet the light remained. A faint orange glow that flickered even when the wind died. The villagers gathered to see it, speaking in low tones. The minister said a prayer, but the light did not fade. Samuel stayed home that night. His mother said nothing of the lantern, only placed more wood on the fire and kept the shutters closed. As the hours passed, the glow outside dimmed, fading finally into the dark. The next morning, the crossroads looked unchanged. The posts stood straight, the lantern cold. the fields were quiet again. Only one thing had altered. In the soft mud near the edge of the road, beside the place where the woman had stood, lay a small bundle of dried herbs bound with red thread. No one claimed it. That evening, the minister assigned the lantern to another child, but none stepped forward. The silence in the meeting house stretched long until he dismissed them. After that night, the lantern was left unlit. The post leaned further each season, the glass cracked, the hook rusted. Yet sometimes, when the fog came down from the marsh, a faint light would appear there again. Not bright, not steady, just enough to catch the edge of the road, to guide anyone passing between the fields. And though no one spoke of it aloud, every villager knew to keep their eyes forward when they crossed that place, and never, under any circumstance, to look toward the field where the fog moved like breath against the ground. The thaw brought rain that lasted for nearly a week. It fell without pause, steady and cold, soaking the ground until the roads turned to dark rivers of mud. The roofs dripped constantly, the sound filling every room, every silence. Smoke clung low to the chimneys, trapped beneath the weight of the clouds. The marsh swelled until it reached the edges of the fields, swallowing fences and furrows alike. The air smelled of wet wood, decay, and something older, the scent of earth that had not been dry in months. The village held close to its hearths. Fires burned day and night, not just for warmth, but for company. People visited one another more often, carrying loaves of bread, jars of dried beans, or candles moulded in uneven shapes. They stayed longer than usual, speaking quietly, sometimes about weather, sometimes about scripture, though their words circled always around the same unspoken worry. It wasn't only the rain. It was the stillness beneath it, the way the wind refused to move, the way sound seemed swallowed before it reached the air. One evening, as the rain fell hardest, the minister walked home from the meeting house. The road was nearly impassable, water rising around his boots with every step. The sky had no shape, only a dull grey that pressed low over the fields. His lantern cast a small circle of light that trembled each time he moved. Behind him, the church bell hung silent, its frame dripping with water. Ahead, the faint outline of the houses glowed through the mist. Small, square shapes, made soft by the rain. When he reached his door, he paused. A sound came from within. Not footsteps, not voices, just a dull creak, like a beam shifting under weight. He waited, listening, but the sound did not come again. He entered quietly, shutting the door behind him. His wife looked up from the fire, her expression tired. The pot beside her hissed softly, the scent of broth filling the air. "You're late," she said. "The road's flooded," he replied. "The marsh is nearly at the bridge." She nodded without surprise. "It'll reach us soon, if it keeps on." He removed his coat, hanging it by the door. As he did, he noticed a dark line near the latch, a thin streak that ran from the top of the frame down to the base. At first he thought it was water, but when he touched it, it felt rough, not wet. His fingers came away grey, ash. He rubbed it between his fingers, glancing toward his wife. "Did you mark this?" She turned, frowning. "Mark what?" He stepped aside so she could see. The line was faint but deliberate, drawn with a single steady motion, beginning just above the latch and ending cleanly near the floor. She shook her head. It wasn't there this morning. He studied it a moment longer, then wiped his hand on his coat. "It's nothing," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. That night, he dreamed of the hill, not as it was, But as it had been years before the gallows broke, before the widow's cottage had turned grey with smoke. In the dream, the hill was bare, the sky white, and something moved just beneath the surface of the earth, slow, pulsing, like a heartbeat. He woke before dawn, his chest tight, the sound of rain filling the silence around him. By morning, the line on the door had darkened. It was thicker now, the edges rougher, as though something had drawn over it again in the night. His wife saw it first when she went to open the door. "It's changed," she said quietly. He came to look. The mark now curved slightly at its base, forming a small hook that bent back toward the latch. It looked intentional, almost like writing, though no letter he knew. He fetched a cloth and tried to wipe it away. The ash smeared, but did not fade. He rubbed harder until the wood itself began to splinter. Still it remained. That afternoon, he walked to the meeting house, hoping for company, for something ordinary, but the village itself felt altered. Doors stood half open despite the rain, as though people forgot to close them. Smoke drifted unevenly from chimneys, some curling straight up, others blowing sideways, though no wind stirred. Children stood in doorways, silent, watching him pass. He nodded to them, but none waved back. When he reached the church, he found Mrs. Elkins waiting inside. Her shawl was soaked through, her hands clasped tightly before her. She rose when he entered. "It's happened to me as well," she said. "What has?" "The mark." She turned her hands outward. Her palms were smudged with grey. "I found it on my door this morning, same as yours." He frowned. "Perhaps soot from the hearth?" "No," she said. "It's drawn. Someone made it." "Who?" She shook her head. "I haven't seen a soul near my house for days." The minister stood silent, listening to the steady drip of rain against the roof. The air inside the church felt close, heavy. "I'll come see it," he said at last. They walked together through the narrow lanes, their feet sinking into the mud. The rain had softened to a fine mist, though the air remained thick. When they reached her house, she stopped at the threshold. The mark was there, nearly identical to his own, a single line drawn from top to bottom, ending in a hook. The wood beneath it was slightly scorched. He bent close, studying it. The surface was rough to the touch, the ash embedded deep in the grain. He traced the curve at the base, then straightened. No one could draw this without being seen. Then how did it come? He had no answer. That evening, the same mark appeared on another door, this time near the edge of the village. Then another the next night, and another after that, each the same, a vertical stroke ending in a curved tail. Some were faint, as though drawn with a shaking hand. Others were dark, sharp, burned into the wood itself. None could be washed away. The villagers gathered at the meeting house, voices raised in confusion. Some said it was a warning from God, others a curse, still others the work of restless spirits. The minister listened, his face pale, his hands clasped tight behind his back. "We will not give fear a place to rest," he said finally. "The marks mean nothing if we refuse to see meaning in them. Keep your faith, keep your hearts burning, and they will fade." But they did not fade. By the end of the week, nearly every door bore the mark. The air inside the village seemed heavier, the nights longer. Dogs barked without reason, then fell silent. The marsh overflowed, swallowing the first row of fences. The road to the hill vanished beneath the water. The minister lay awake most nights, listening to the creak of the timbers and the hiss of rain against the shutters. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the house. Once, when he rose to look, he saw faint shapes moving through the mist, figures without detail, passing between the trees. He did not open the door. Then, one morning, the marks began to change. On some doors, the lines thickened, spreading outward in branching patterns that looked like roots or veins. On others, they faded at the edges, leaving behind faint impressions like shadows burned into the wood. The villagers no longer tried to clean them. They nailed crosses above their thresholds, sprinkled salt across their steps, and whispered prayers before sleep. On the fourth night, the minister awoke to the sound of his wife crying softly beside him. "It's inside," she said. He sat up. The fire had burned low, casting the room in a dull orange glow. The smell of smoke hung thick in the air. "What is?" he asked. She pointed toward the far wall. The mark was there now, drawn beside the window, faint but visible. The same line, the same curve, but this time traced on the inside. He rose slowly, crossing the room. The air near the wall felt colder. He touched the mark with his fingertips. The ash clung to his skin. "Go back to bed," he said softly. "I'll keep watch." She did not argue. He sat by the hearth, feeding the fire until the flames rose steady again. The hours passed without sound. Then, just before dawn, the mark darkened. It spread along the wall, the ash deepening, the wood beneath it cracking faintly. He stood, heart pounding. The line curved once more, forming not a hook this time, but a circle. A small, closed loop at the end of the stroke. He stepped back as a faint hiss came from the wood, like breath escaping from between teeth. Then the sound stopped. When the light returned, the wall was clean again. The mark had vanished completely. He touched the spot where it had been, but the surface was cool, smooth, unscarred. His wife slept through the morning without waking once. Later that day, as the rain finally began to ease, the villagers noticed something strange. The marks on every door had faded overnight. Where once the ash had been dark, now only faint outlines remained, pale like the memory of soot. No one could explain it. Some took it as a sign that the worst had passed. Others feared it meant something yet to come. The minister said nothing. That evening, when he walked the road toward the marsh, he stopped near the place where the lantern once stood at the crossroads. The post was gone now, washed away by the storm, but the ground still bore its mark, a dark ring of soil where nothing grew. He stood there a long time, listening. The water in the marsh moved quietly, lapping against the reeds. Somewhere far off a crow called, its voice thin and tired. When he returned home, he noticed something on his door. Not a mark this time, but a small bundle tied with red thread hanging from the latch. Inside the cloth were dried herbs, sage, salt, and something sweet he couldn't name. The smell was faint but familiar. He untied the bundle and held it for a long moment. Then he placed it above the hearth, beside the Bible, and said nothing. That night, the rain stopped completely. The wind shifted to the west. The fog rolled back across the marsh, curling low through the fields before drifting toward the village once more. The roads dried slowly, the air clearing. Yet even as the days grew longer and the sun returned, those who had lived through that week of marks found themselves glancing often at their doors, half expecting to see the grey line return. And though the wood remained clean and no new ash appeared, a faint scent of smoke lingered in every doorway, the kind that never truly fades, only waits. The nights turned colder again, though no frost touched the ground. The air felt hollow, emptied of sound, as if the land itself were waiting for something to begin. The fields, once bright with new shoots, had stopped growing, the soil too wet to till. The marsh had receded slightly, leaving behind strips of dark silt that cracked when stepped upon. A stillness hung over everything, not peace, not calm, but something heavier. Even the birds seemed quieter now, their calls brief, uncertain, as though unwilling to linger in the air. The minister had stopped writing in his study. The ink had dried in its well, the pages left half-filled. The Bible lay open on his desk, untouched for days. He no longer lit the candle that burned beside it, preferring instead the light of the hearth that reached just far enough to outline the corners of the room. His wife watched him with quiet concern, but did not press him to speak. There was little to say that had not already been said, and even less that could be answered. It was on one of those nights, long after the lamps had gone out in the village, that the first sound came. Faint at first, almost gentle, a soft, hollow knock, as though something small tapped against the boards high above the ceiling. The sound came once, then again, evenly spaced. The minister lifted his head from where he sat by the fire. His wife stirred but did not wake. He listened, holding his breath. The knock came a third time, a little louder. He rose slowly, the chair creaking beneath him. He looked upward, toward the beams that ran across the ceiling. The sound had come from there, near the roofline, above their bedchamber. He waited, the house silent, but for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then came another knock, followed by a faint scraping, like nails dragging lightly across the wood. The sound moved along the beam, slow and deliberate, then stopped. He took the lantern from the hook near the hearth, lit it, and stepped into the narrow stairway that led to the upper floor. The boards beneath his feet groaned, the light shifting across the walls. At the top, the air felt colder, as though the fire below hadn't reached this far. He crossed the small landing, his hand brushing the rough plaster of the walls, and opened the door to the attic. The hinges gave a low moan. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. The rafters were low, the roof slanting sharply downward. Boxes lined the edges, filled with old books, candle stubs, and scraps of fabric. The beam at the centre stretched the length of the room, dark with age. He lifted the lantern higher, its glow catching on cobwebs that hung in the corners. Nothing moved. He stepped forward, careful not to disturb the loose boards. The silence was deep enough to hear the faint hum of his own breath. He set the lantern on the floor, its flame trembling slightly. Kneeling, he pressed his hand against the beam. The wood was cold but dry. He ran his fingers along it until he felt something. A shallow groove, freshly made. He leaned closer. The mark was narrow, cut cleanly into the grain, like the impression left by a blade or claw. He followed it with his fingers. It stretched only a few inches before stopping abruptly. Then the knock came again. This time it was directly beneath him. The sound echoed through the floorboards, sharp and hollow, 3 quick taps in a row. He froze. The light from the lantern flickered, the flame bending slightly as though disturbed by breath. He stared down at the boards beneath his knees. The sound came again, slower now, each knock drawn out, deliberate. He stood quickly, taking the lantern with him, and back toward the stairs. As he reached the door, the last knock sounded, softer, almost careful, as if whatever made it did not want to wake the house. Then silence. He descended the stairs without looking back, closing the attic door behind him. When he returned to the fire, his wife had woken. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Only the wood," he said. "It shifts in the cold." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded and lay back down. He remained by the fire until morning. The next day, he went to the attic again. The mark on the beam was still there, unchanged. But beneath it, near the floorboards, a new one had appeared, smaller, fainter, as though traced by the tip of a finger. It curved downward slightly, forming a shape not unlike the marks that had appeared on the doors weeks before. He wiped it with a cloth, but it did not fade. That night, the knocking returned. It came later this time, just before dawn, when the house was darkest. The same pattern, 3 knocks, then silence. His wife stirred beside him, eyes opening in the dim light. "You hear it too," she whispered. He nodded. "It isn't the wood," she said. He rose again, lantern in hand, and climbed the stairs. The air felt heavier, the boards colder. The attic seemed smaller than before, the shadows thicker. He stood beneath the beam and listened. The sound did not come again, but as he turned to leave, he saw something near the far wall. A small pile of ash, grey and fine, directly below where the mark had been carved. He crouched beside it, running his fingers through it. It was cold, without scent, as though it had been there for years. He took a small piece of it between his thumb and forefinger and rubbed it. It left a faint smear on his skin, dark and oily. When he looked up, he noticed faint lines along the beam above, scratches, small and uneven, trailing downward toward the floor. He backed away slowly, closing the attic door behind him once more. The knocking continued for 3 more nights. Always the same pattern, always near dawn. Sometimes it seemed to move. One night from the attic, another from the walls near the stairwell, once from directly above the bed. The minister stopped sleeping. He sat by the hearth, lantern burning low, waiting for the sound. When it came, he counted the knocks, breathing evenly, refusing to speak. On the 5th night, it changed. The sound began earlier, near midnight, and did not stop. The knocks came faster, irregular, moving through the beams like footsteps. The walls trembled slightly, the light in the lantern shuddering with each strike. His wife clutched his arm, whispering prayers under her breath. He stood, took the lantern, and moved toward the stairs. "Don't go up," she said. He hesitated, but the sound grew louder. Something heavy shifted above them, the boards creaking. He climbed slowly, 1 step at a time, his hands steady on the rail. When he reached the attic door, the sound stopped. The silence was immediate, suffocating. He waited, his ear close to the wood. Nothing. He pushed the door open. The attic was empty. He raised the lantern, the light sweeping across the room. The beam, the boxes, the floor, all still. But when he turned toward the far corner, he saw it. A new mark, drawn on the wall itself. A line of ash, thin and curved, ending in a circle. It was the same as before, the same pattern that had vanished from their door. Only now, it was here, inside, drawn at eye level. He stepped closer. The air near it was cold enough to burn his skin. The ash trembled slightly, though no wind moved. He reached out, and the moment his finger touched the edge of the mark, the lantern flickered out. He froze in the dark, the silence so complete he could hear his pulse. Then came the knock. A single one from behind him, close, almost at his shoulder. He turned sharply, the lantern swinging, its glass striking the beam. A spark flared, catching the oil. For an instant, the room filled with light. There was nothing there. He stamped out the flame, the smoke rising thick and acrid. When he relit the lantern, the mark on the wall was gone. Only the faint black stain of smoke remained. By morning, he told no one. He went to the church as usual, his sermon quiet, restrained. The villagers noticed his pallor but said nothing. When he returned home, his wife was sitting by the fire, her hands clasped tightly. "It knocked while you were gone," she said. He said nothing. That night, he placed salt along the threshold, sprinkled it in the corners of every room, and left the lantern burning until dawn. The knocking did not come. The next night, he did the same, and again the house stayed silent. For a week, there was peace. Then, without warning, it began again. Not at dawn this time, but at dusk. The sound came from within the walls themselves, softer now, slower, as though testing the wood. The minister followed it with his ear, moving from room to room. The knocking moved with him, always just ahead, always faint. When he stopped in the doorway to the attic stairs, it stopped too. He stood there for a long time, the lantern in his hand, the light trembling. Then quietly a voice came, faint, low, from somewhere beyond the boards. It spoke no words he could understand, only a sound like breath passing through hollow wood. He stepped back, his hand tightening on the lantern's handle. The sound stopped. The next morning, he found a small patch of ash on the kitchen floor, another near the stair rail, another beneath the window, each the same size, perfectly round, as though something had rested there briefly and then moved on. He swept them away, though the stains remained. By the end of the month, the knocking had spread through the village. Others began to hear it. First the Elkins' house, then the blacksmith's, then the weaver's loft. Always at night, always from the rafters. The people spoke of it in whispers, afraid to name it aloud. They lit candles at every window, drew symbols in chalk across their doors. Some prayed louder, others not at all. The minister spoke to them on Sunday. "The house of faith is strong," he said, "but it cannot stand if every beam trembles with fear. Whatever this is, it will pass. It feeds only on what we give it." Yet when he returned home that evening, he found his wife standing in the doorway, her face pale. She pointed upward. The ceiling above the hearth was darkened, a faint line of ash trailing along the beam. At the end of it, near the wall, the shape of a handprint, clear, small, and perfect, pressed into the soot as though made by flesh. He closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he said, "Keep the fire burning." That night, he sat awake again, the lantern dim beside him, the sound of the wind returning through the chimney. The knock did not come, but just before dawn, as the fire burned low, a faint creak echoed above him, followed by a single sound. Not a knock this time, but a sigh, long and soft, like someone settling into sleep. When the morning came, the beam above the hearth was clean, the ash gone. The house smelled faintly of smoke and herbs, and though no new marks appeared, and no knocks came after, the minister never entered the attic again. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind fell still, he would sit by the fire and hear the faintest sound above him, not loud enough to wake his wife, not enough to make him rise, just a small, hollow tap, like the memory of something that had once lived between the beams, keeping time with the breath of the house itself. And each time, he would add another log to the fire and whisper, not a prayer, but a simple word, steady and low, meant only for the dark that listened beyond the rafters. The year had turned again, though it was hard to tell where one season ended and the next began. The air hung cool and damp, and the days passed with little difference between morning and dusk. The marsh still breathed in its slow rhythm, rising and falling with the tide beneath the soil. The church bell had not rung in months. though its weight remained overhead, waiting. The villagers no longer spoke of the knocking or the marks. They had folded the memory away like something wrapped in cloth and kept in a drawer, close at hand but best left untouched. The minister kept to his house. His sermons grew shorter still, quieter, and his congregation smaller. He no longer looked toward the hill when he left the church, and the path that led there had vanished under grass and weeds. Yet sometimes, when he passed the old crossroads, he would glance toward the field where the fog gathered thickest. He never stopped walking, but he always slowed for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air, as though waiting for something to move in the mist. Inside the house, the hearth burned almost constantly. His wife kept the fire alive through every hour of daylight and long into the night, as though the flames themselves guarded the walls. The warmth clung to the rooms unevenly, hot near the stone, cold in the corners. The shadows in those corners grew heavier as the days shortened again. The minister had noticed it but said nothing. He had grown used to the small unease that lived with them now, the kind that moved softly between breaths. One evening, as the last of the daylight faded, his wife went to the cupboard and brought out a small mirror wrapped in linen. It was oval, framed in wood, worn smooth by years of handling. She unwrapped it slowly and set it on the table near the fire. "I found this in the attic," she said. "It was your mother's." He looked at it for a long time before speaking. "It should have stayed there." "It caught the light," she said quietly. "I thought it might brighten the room." The firelight reflected in the glass, flickering softly. The surface was dark, not entirely clear, as though the silver beneath had tarnished. He could see his own shape there, faint and distorted, the orange glow of the flames dancing at the edge of his reflection. His wife turned away to stir the pot by the hearth. As the fire crackled, the mirror shifted slightly on the table. He reached out to steady it, though he hadn't seen it move. When his hand touched the frame, it was cold, colder than the air. He turned it toward the wall, so it no longer caught the light. That night, as they sat by the fire, his wife spoke softly. "The women used to look into mirrors by candlelight on All Hallows' Eve," she said, "to see what waited for them, love, death, or the shadow of what was coming." He said nothing. "They said if the flame bent toward the glass, the mirror showed the truth. If it bent away, the mirror lied." "Superstition," he muttered, though his voice lacked weight. "Still," she said, "they believed." The fire hissed softly. The light shifted again, bending slightly toward the table where the mirror lay turned against the wall. That night, when the house had gone still, the minister woke suddenly. The fire had burned low, the coals faintly red. He rose to stir them, but something caught his eye. Across the room, the mirror lay flat now, its face turned upward. He frowned. He didn't remember moving it, and his wife still slept beside the hearth, her breathing steady. He knelt beside the table. The glass caught the dim red light of the embers, distorting it. For a moment, he thought he saw movement within the reflection. A brief flash, as if something passed between the fire and the mirror, though no shadow crossed the room. He leaned closer, his breath clouding the glass. The surface trembled, only slightly, but enough to blur his reflection. Then it cleared again, showing only the coals behind him. He turned away, added wood to the fire, and covered the mirror once more. In the morning, the house smelled faintly of burned wax. A thin trail of ash led from the hearth to the table, stopping just short of the place where the mirror lay. His wife noticed it first. "Did you burn something last night?" He shook his head. "No." She bent to look closer. The ash was fine, grey, almost powder. It starts at the fire. It's nothing, he said, though he felt the lie even as he spoke it. The day passed without event. The sky remained heavy, the clouds low. The villagers moved through their routines, tending livestock, hauling water, chopping wood, all with the quiet rhythm of people who preferred not to think beyond what their hands were doing. The minister visited 2 homes, said brief prayers over one sickbed, and returned home before dusk. When he entered, the house felt warmer than usual, the fire burning brighter. His wife sat near it, her shawl drawn close, staring at the mirror. It stood upright on the table again, uncovered. The light from the fire danced across its surface. It moved, she said. What do you mean? I left it against the wall this morning. When I came back, it was standing. He approached, glancing at the floor. No marks, no sign of it being shifted. Perhaps the table isn't even, he said, though his tone betrayed no conviction. She didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the mirror. Do you see it? He followed her gaze. For a moment, he saw only their reflections, faint shapes lit by the fire's glow. Then, as the flames bent, another shape seemed to form at the edge of the glass. It was brief. The suggestion of a shadow standing where none should be, behind them, at the far side of the room. He turned, but the corner was empty. When he looked back, the reflection was normal again. He took the mirror in both hands, lifted it, and set it face down on the table. We'll put it away tomorrow, he said. His wife nodded, though she did not look relieved. That night, the wind returned, rising hard against the shutters. The fire hissed and bent. Somewhere upstairs, a door creaked, then closed again. The minister sat awake until the first grey of dawn reached the windows. When he finally rose, he found the mirror back on its edge, facing the hearth. He stared at it for a long time before touching it. The wood frame was warm now, as if it had absorbed the heat of the fire. The glass held a faint film of moisture that cleared slowly as he watched. Beneath it, his reflection looked older, heavier. Behind his reflection, the fire flickered, the flames bending toward the mirror. He turned the glass over once more and left the house without eating. By midday, he reached the church. The air inside was cold and dry, the pews empty. The windows let in a dull light that pooled across the floor. He walked to the pulpit, rested his hands on its edge, and closed his eyes. The silence pressed close. Whatever it is, he whispered, it will not have this place. His words echoed faintly, swallowed by the wood and stone. He stayed there for hours, unmoving. When he finally returned home, the smell of smoke met him at the door. The fire had burned out. His wife sat beside the hearth, the mirror in her lap. Her face was pale. It's warm, she said quietly. He crossed the room quickly. The glass was indeed warm, not hot enough to burn, but steady, like living flesh. He took it from her hands and carried it outside into the cold air. The sky was grey, the ground damp. He set the mirror against the side of the house and stepped back. The surface caught the dim light, dull and uneven. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, the reflection of the window beside it began to waver. The glass rippled like water disturbed by a stone. He blinked, and it stilled. He lifted a cloth, covered it, and brought it to the shed behind the house. There, among the tools and wood, he placed it face down beneath an old plank. The moment the glass touched the earth, a faint hiss came from the soil, like steam meeting cold iron. He stepped back, breathing hard, and closed the shed door. That night, For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet. No knocks, no creaks, no whisper of movement in the rafters. The fire burned steady and calm. His wife slept soundly. He watched the flames until sleep finally took him. In the morning, the peace held. The sun broke weakly through the clouds, the air warmer. The smell of rain had lifted. He went outside to fetch wood. When he opened the shed door, the air inside was still, cool. The mirror lay where he had left it, covered. He lifted the cloth slightly. The glass beneath was cracked through the centre. The break ran cleanly from top to bottom, dividing his faint reflection in two. He replaced the cloth and shut the door. That afternoon, he walked through the village. People greeted him more easily now, their eyes lighter. Even the children played in the street again, their laughter sharp in the cool air. He stayed out longer than usual, speaking with the blacksmith about repairs to the church roof. When he finally returned home at dusk, the house was warm, the smell of bread thick in the air. His wife smiled faintly. "It's over," she said. He wanted to believe her. But as night fell and the fire dimmed, the glass of the window nearest the hearth caught the reflection of the flames. For a moment, it looked almost like the mirror. The same soft flicker, the same slow bend of light. The flames leaned toward the glass, their colour deepening to red. He blinked, and the image vanished. The fire steadied. He didn't mention it. 2 nights later, as he sat by the hearth writing, he noticed the reflection of his candle on the window pane again. The flame bent sideways, though no draught moved in the room. He leaned closer, watching. The glass trembled slightly. The reflection blurred, then sharpened again, and in that brief moment, another face appeared beside his own. Pale, indistinct, watching. He turned sharply, but there was nothing behind him. He rose, covered the window with a cloth, and left the candle burning until morning. When the dawn came grey and cold, his wife found him still seated by the fire, his pen in hand, the paper before him blank. She said nothing, only placed her hand on his shoulder and added wood to the flames. Later that day, the shed caught fire. No one saw how it started. The flames rose high, sending black smoke across the yard. The villagers came running, carrying buckets, shouting. The fire burned fast, devouring the dry boards in minutes. When it finally died, nothing remained but ash and a few pieces of scorched metal. The mirror was gone. That night, the wind changed again, blowing from the marsh. The fog rolled in, low and heavy, pressing against the windows. The fire burned higher than usual, the flames leaning slightly toward the wall. The minister sat beside it, silent, his face lit by the shifting light. He thought of the glass, of the way reflections never truly disappear, only wait in whatever surface will take them next. As the house settled into silence, he looked once more at the window near the hearth. The fog outside pressed thick against it, and for a moment in the glow of the fire, he thought he saw the faint outline of a hand on the other side of the glass. Small, pale, unmoving. He did not rise. He simply watched until the fire burned low and the fog hid the shape completely. When morning came, the glass was clear again. Only the faintest smudge remained where the shape had been. The fire was cold, the ash white and fine. And though the mirror was gone, the reflection of the flame still flickered in the corners of the room, moving softly against the walls, as if something unseen carried the light from one surface to another, unwilling to let it die. The wind shifted in the late afternoon, turning cold and steady, the kind that runs along the bones of the houses and settles there. Smoke went flat against the roofs. Doors were pulled to with a firmer hand. The marsh lay dull and dark beneath a low sky, its slow tide pressing at the reeds and then easing back, a quiet pull that never stopped. The fields were colourless in the last light. Fences leaned, lanes held puddles, thin ice forming at the rims when shadows reached them. The church stood above it all, a narrow shape on the rise with the weight of its bell held quiet in the throat of the tower. The minister walked the path to the meeting house earlier than usual. He paused twice, once to catch the distant sound of oxen being led to water, once to watch a strip of fog unroll itself along a stone wall. His boots found the same worn places in the road that his boots had always found. The door to the church yielded with the old scrape. Inside, the air was cooler than the outdoors, a clean stillness that smelled of old timber, wax and damp wool. He set a candle on the pulpit and did not light it. The grey was enough for a while. He stood with both hands on the rail and let his eyes rest on the cross, not for comfort, not for dread, only for steadiness. Footsteps came in the aisle and stopped at the second bench. Mrs. Elkins sat without greeting, her hands folded, her shawl damp at the edges. She looked thinner than the month before. Her eyes had that fixed patience that shows itself when sleep comes poorly. "The boy," she said, "he wakes at the same time each night now." Her voice did not carry complaint. He sits up and listens as if someone is walking the eaves. Then he lies down and does not know he has slept at all. The minister nodded once. "Keep the lamp burning. Keep water by the bed. Salt at the threshold." He spoke as if listing chores. It was better that way. She lowered her gaze, then lifted it again. "He hears the tower, even when it is still." She said it plainly. Not the bell, the tower, the wood. He had heard it as well on certain nights when the wind came across the marsh in a straight line, a sound too low to be a creak and too steady to be a groan, a held note without a source. He did not say so. He told her to send for him if the boy worsened and watched her leave with the soft drag of wet skirts on the aisle planks. Dusk settled early, the light going down in slow degrees until the windows were panes of pewter. The minister remained until the benches had lost their edges and the aisle lay in a single band from door to pulpit. He struck the tinder and cupped the weak flame to the candle. The light bent once and steadied. He waited for the rope to move or the rung to stir, the way a man waits for an old dog to come to heel. Nothing came, only the sound of the marsh drawing breath and letting it go. When he stepped outside, the first frost had found the puddles in the yard. The ground answered his weight with a brittle sound. The hill showed no shape to it, except the darker line of the stones. Far off, a lantern moved along a fence and vanished. He walked home with the sense that the path had lengthened by a few quiet yards, as if the lane were teaching him to count it again without thinking. The hour before midnight runs thin in New England. Fire sinks to coals. Chairs are left as they happen to be. Bread is wrapped. Hooks hold their coats. In that hour, the village holds its breath in small ways, without meaning to. The minister knew that hour well, and had come to measure it by the weight of the poker in his hand when he set it back in its iron ring. He had measured it by the sound of water against the sides of the kettle, and by the space between his own heartbeats when the house lay even. His wife kept to her habitual work long after there was any need. She plucked a burr from a blanket and took a seam out and put it back in again. The mirror was gone to ash and gone beyond ash, but she sometimes still turned the window cloth aside to watch the flame's shape in the glass, and then let the cloth fall again. The night allowed her that. The night had taken larger things for itself. They had grown used to counting the hours by ear. The clock on the mantel could be trusted only when the weather was dry. Tonight it lagged and hurried by turns, so they listened instead to the outer things. A board settled in the wall of the weaver's loft. A latch gave a short answer on the lane that turned to the marsh. The minister said he would go back to the church at first light and see to the rope that had begun to fray where it met the iron ring. His wife said he might as well take oil to the hinges. She set the poker flat across the hearthstone, a small practice that neither of them named. When midnight came, it came without flourish. The room did not grow colder. The fire did not bend. The hour laid itself down as a weight, and the weight was felt first by the tower. There was no movement at the rope and no draught in the belfry, yet the bell acknowledged the hour with a voice that belonged to neither metal nor air. It did not ring. It hollowed the space around it. The sound walked from the tower into the rafters of the church, into the joints of the door, into the grain of the benches. It went into the posts of the fence and the legs of tables. It passed along the grip of tools and set its hand lightly on the rims of buckets. It did not wake children. It did not crack glass. It sounded in the timbers the way a memory sounds in a person who has not spoken for a very long time. Men who had never heard it from the tower heard it in their beds, by the way the bedstead gave back a faint echo from itself. Women heard it in the handles of drawers when they touched them. Dogs lifted their heads and then lay them down again, as if the sound were only a change in the air. A ladle resting beside a cold pot gave a single answer and was quiet. The minister stood without knowing he had stood. He knew the hour without the clock. He took the poker from its ring and set it down again because there was nothing to guard. The sound had no direction. It did not amplify and did not recede. It drew a line through things and then drew it again without haste. He went to the door and set his hand beneath the latch. The wood there was warm from the house and colder a finger's width beyond. He did not open it. Across the lane, Mrs. Elkins sat upright with the boy's breath against her sleeve. He had not wakened. His lips moved with the small works of a child's sleep, the way a mouth learns its shapes again after a fever. She watched the shutter slats ease with the slight pressure of the night air and saw them ease back again. The sound touched the stool on which she rested her feet and made it lighter. She did nothing more than put her palm flat to the floor, counting the seconds between her own heartbeats and the steady settling noises of a house that knows itself. At the crossroads, where the lantern post had been and left only a bare circle of dirt, the sound went through the ring of ground as if it were iron. It crossed the roadway and stepped through the low hillock where boys had buried a jack with its candle still warm one last season. It moved the coals of that distant act in no way a man could see. If anyone had stood with an ear to the earth there, they would have heard only their own heat. The marsh received the sound last and held it closest. The reeds carried it to one another with a small dry conversation of leaves. Water took it in and fixed a slow pulse to it. The hill kept its old silence. The broken frame that had once held its beam neither answered nor refused. The sound ran around its base and climbed no farther. The hour went long. The sound did not ring in strokes. It was presence more than speech. When it shifted all at once, not in volume but in shape, like a steady hand choosing another line of work and doing it with the same care. The first shape had measured what could bear it. The second set itself to the things that remembered. The mark on the doors had been washed and worn away weeks earlier. The wood had held the ash and given it up. But the places where the ash had been took the sound differently. Those thresholds gave a low return. the way a held cup gives back a tone when tapped. No one standing in a room could have pointed to it. No one could have named a pitch. Yet everyone who had lived with those marks felt a steadiness in their ankles, as if the floor had learned their weight again. Samuel Price, who had carried the clay pot and learned the path to the post without looking at his feet, woke with his eyes open and his breath quiet. The room around him was only a room. The sound was not in the rafters. It was in the wood of the small chair where he kept his boots, and in the board his bed touched at the head. He put his hand against that board. The wood gave back a patient answer. He let his hand rest there until he fell asleep again. The minister's wife went to the hearth, lifted the kettle from its hook, and set it on stone. Her hands were steady. She pushed the coals together to a firmer bed. The flame answered in the ordinary way. She stood a moment longer than there was any need, and then she sat and folded the cloth she had been mending. The sound filled the fold and left it. The tower itself did not move. The rope did not twitch. The bell hung as a weight hangs. Yet in that hour, the church did its own keeping. The windows did not cloud. The door did not draw moisture. The pulpit rail, which had loosened at the join, held fast. The hymnals kept their damp and did not take more. The bench that had begun to complain under the blacksmith's shoulders found a different answer to the nail that held it. The building recognized itself in every place, as a man finds his breath manageable again after a hill. When the hour was near its end, the sound changed once more. It thinned, not in force but in breadth, drawing inward the way water gathers to itself before it finds a seam in the earth and goes on. Those who were awake felt it narrow from the corners of rooms to the common entries, and from those entries to the places where hands most often rested. Finally, it went into the wood around latches and the heads of brass nails and the small flaws in tables where knives had once missed their work. It went into the grain of spoons and into the bail of a pail. There it waited, the air released. The houses gave back their own small familiar ticks. The marsh kept its long breath. No one spoke for a time. Speech has a way of bouncing against a thing that has just left. Better to let the walls take it first and then return it. The minister sat until the coals showed their faint blue at the edges. He rose and fed them. He stood at the window and lifted the edge of the cloth with 2 fingers. Fog lay down in the low ground between houses in even layers, neither coming nor going. The meeting house showed its shape without any sheen. He let the cloth fall again. A cart creaked early on the far lane, a cautious wheel over a place that stayed soft, even in cold weather. The sound was a comfort because it named a weight and carried it in a direction. A ewe answered itself in a pen without wakening lamb or man. The village found the usual signs of an hour passing. By the time the light made a thin seam under the shutters, the minister had washed and put on his coat. His wife brewed a broth, not because either of them wanted it, but because the body keeps certain time better than the mind. They sat with the bowls and ate without hurry. The day entered without knocking. A frost had traced the grain of the church door in perfect lines, pale on dark wood. When the minister touched it, the pattern softened and the cold went into his skin. He stepped inside, set his hand on the rail, and felt the wood answer as if it had been planed in the last week. The smell of oil had risen from no jar. Dust had settled less than it should. He put his palm flat on the pulpit and let it be. He climbed the ladder to the belfry. The rope looked as it had, worn where a hand must take it and sound where a hand never reaches. The iron ring bore a shallow bloom of moisture. He wiped it with his sleeve. The bell itself gave no reflection except a dull copy of the square of light where the louver opened to the east. He laid a single finger against the lip of the bell and took it away. The metal held the cold it had always held. He stayed there until his legs felt the ladder and then went down. The village met the morning with its ordinary patience. Men cut wood and took care to set the pieces in even stacks that would not tumble if the wind shifted. Women beat rugs at the sill to knock the damp out of them. Children were sent to draw water and told not to lean, looking for their faces in the pail, which they did anyway. Samuel's mother tied a string around the boy's glove at the wrist and told him not to lose it. Mrs. Elkins folded a clean sheet for the bed and smoothed it with both hands. The blacksmith set his hammer to the anvil and let it fall once to learn the day's sound. Toward noon, fog came up again from the marsh, light and ragged, and sent a cool line through the street at knee height. Chickens stepped through it without noticing. The sound of the hour left no trace in the air, but the things it had rested in held its calm the way bread holds warmth long after it leaves the oven. By late afternoon, talk began to find a single shape. Not loud talk, not gathered talk, not the kind that wants answer or argument. 2 words said when a door closed or a kettle found its hook. The bells, not rang, not rung, not appeal. The bells, as one might say the tide or the wind or the frost. A fact, not an event. The minister heard the words outside the weaver's loft, and heard them again when a man lifted a sack of grain and found it heavier than he'd planned. He neither joined nor corrected. He carried oil to the hinge that had begun to rasp and set his ladder against the post by the churchyard gate and scraped the soft growth from its top. He paused to watch a crow debate a thin branch and decide against it for another. He put his ladder away. Toward evening, a child carrying a loaf wrapped in cloth turned at the crossroads without thinking, and then thought again and kept to the track that stayed higher by a hand's width. The ring of bare earth where the lantern had stood showed darker under a shallow skin of damp. The child noticed it because children notice circles. He did not step in it. He did not step around it in any careful way either. He went along. Twilight settled with less chill than the night before. Doors were set to but not barred. Lamps were lit at the hour they are always lit. A few stayed dark a little longer, the way a body draws a breath and holds it before answering. The meeting house windows gave back a faint gold until the hearths in other places outshone them and then took that place. The tower showed its shape against a sky that could not choose between blue and iron. In the minister's house, the evening meal sat easily. Spoon to bowl, bowl to table, hands to cloth. No one named the hour behind them. The poker found its ring with the small click that tells a room its work is even. The kettle made a soft sound at the edge of a boil and then stopped. Night came plain. The clock performed as a decent clock. The windows wore their cloth. The floor held when a chair gave a little. The marsh kept the light it makes for itself when the moon is not willing. The hill kept its line against the sky. The broken frame there kept its dimensions and took on no more. When midnight approached again, the air did not lean. The houses did not pick themselves up to meet it. The hour arrived as any hour arrives when the day before has taught you that the thing you dread might be only another manner of time passing. The bell did not sound a second night. The wood did not answer itself. Beds slept through. Coals kept their red and sank. Still, before sleep, many put a hand to a familiar surface and let it answer back. A table edge, a doorpost worn by the place where a thumb always goes, a tread that carries a weight more often than the others. The answers were low and plain. The houses were themselves. The sound that had filled them had not broken anything that work could not set right when the need came. The minister looked once toward the window, saw his own pale shape in the cloth seam of light, and looked away. He set the Bible not on the table, but on the chair by the hearth, where wood had warmed the seat. He kept his hand on the cover for a count that had no number. He let his breath leave him and come back. Midnight passed into the hour that follows it. The line between them left no mark. A small draught found the seam under the door and then lost it. Somewhere near the marsh, a night bird gave a dry call and received no answer. The tower held the bell as always. The village did not wake to tell itself what it had endured. The village knew by the ease in its doors, by the way the water sat level in a basin without a tremble at the lip, by the feel in a shoulder when a bucket was lifted, by the ordinary weight of the poker in a hand, by the way a mother's palm lay on a child's back and the child did not stir. The night had left the kind of quiet that does not speak for itself, but makes it simpler to hear the next thing. Whatever the next thing was going to be, it would have to step up right to the threshold and ask for its space. The houses would listen. They had learned how. Far down by the marsh edge, the fog gathered into a narrow fold and set itself along the fence. Reeds moved without wind. The water kept its slow draw toward the places under the village that made it rise in cellars in certain months. The hill lifted out of that fog just enough to be counted. The frame kept its angles. Before dawn, the bell, still heavy, proper, gave one small sound, not a note, not an answer, only the bare report of iron adjusting to the night's final cold. Anyone awake would have taken it for the same sound a kettle makes when it cools on stone. The tower made no claim. The hour moved on. The sky loosened by an inch. Light came as a seam along the east. Flocks found their feet. Smoke went straight up for a while. Doors opened on their ordinary hinges. The minister drew his coat close and walked the slope to look at the yard and the rails and the door once more. He set his hand on the wood. It was only wood. He turned toward the path that ran past the graveyard and on toward the fields beyond, where the ground lay flat, as if it were listening. He walked that way without hurry, neither measuring the night behind him, nor preparing words for anyone who might ask. The hour had left a shape in him that was not burden and not relief. It felt like a line drawn steady across a page he had not known was there. He passed the last gate, heard it close itself on its latch with the exact sound it should make, and kept on toward the low places where fog lays its hand at first light and then lifts it again. The houses settled behind him, warm in their corners. The church held its silence properly. The marsh breathed. The hill kept watch in the way a hill keeps watch, without favour. There was more night to come in other seasons. There would be more hours that pressed, and more that eased. The sound that had found the timbers would find them again, or it would not. The village would know by the way bread cooled, and by the way a chair took a weight, and by the manner a child woke and did not remember waking. All of that waited where it always waits. For now, as the seam of light widened, a low wind began that would carry the first small smell of thawed earth. He recognized it and did not name it. He took another step and then another until the ground under his boots told him he had reached the place where the fields start to think about their work again. The breath he drew there felt even. He stood and let the morning take him up in the slow way mornings do when a village has held itself together through a thin hour and not asked more of itself than it could carry. The bell above did nothing more than be a bell. The world made no promise and kept none back. The day waited, and the day would move, and the night that followed would be the night that followed. The fire would need tending. The doors would need their latches checked. A boy would be sent with a message. A woman would lay a clean cloth on a table. A fence would want mending near the marsh bend where rods rot first. Those tasks held the line, and somewhere beyond the edge where the ground goes soft, a single lantern flame would find a way to live in the fog without a post to hang from, and it would mark the place between one thing and the next, with its small, stubborn light, steady enough to carry a body through, until the first pale edges of the morning came on. The frost broke quietly. No one marked the exact morning it happened, because it slipped out between two ordinary days, like breath between words. The marsh softened first, its skin of ice turning thin and fragile, the reeds breaking through in slow green lines. The water beneath moved again, sluggish but alive. Farther inland, the ground gave back the sound of boots instead of the brittle echo it had carried all winter. The road sank under the weight of carts, the ruts filled with grey water, and the fences leaned slightly where the earth had forgotten its hardness. The air smelled of mud, salt, and smoke, the early smell of another season beginning before it was ready. The sky stayed low, colourless, but the edges of daylight lingered longer each evening, as though time had loosened its hold just enough to let the light breathe. The bell tower stood in its usual silence, the church door no longer stiff with cold, its hinges giving the sound of iron remembering warmth. The village itself seemed to exhale, not relief, not joy, but the simple rhythm of something continuing. The minister rose earlier now, before the sun had climbed fully from the marsh. He moved through the rooms in near darkness, the floorboards groaning softly beneath his weight. His wife still slept near the hearth, wrapped in the same wool blanket that had seen every winter since their marriage. The fire was down to a faint bed of coals. He stirred them once, the orange beneath shifting faintly, then added wood until the flame caught again, slow and steady. He walked outside, closing the door behind him with care. The lane was slick, the air wet enough to cling to his sleeves. The fog hung low over the fields, a quiet blanket that swallowed sound and light alike. Somewhere in the distance, a crow gave a thin cry, its wings beating against the damp air. He followed the path toward the church, boots sinking slightly at each step. The door opened easily now. Inside, the stillness felt different than before. Not empty, not expectant, just even. The air was cool, the faint smell of oil and wax lingering. The pews were clean, the floor swept, though he couldn't recall doing it himself. He stood for a long while at the pulpit, hands folded loosely, watching the pale light slide down the wall as the fog outside began to thin. It was the same light that had once filled this place before the storms, before the marks, before the hours that had made the walls tremble. And yet it carried something different now, a softness that came not from safety, but from endurance, the kind of calm that exists after too much sound. When he left the church, the village had begun to stir. Smoke rose from the chimneys, thin and white. Doors opened, voices drifted faintly. He saw Mrs. Elkins standing by her well, her shawl drawn close, watching the water settle after she pulled the first bucket of the day. She nodded to him once. Her boy, older by a year and smaller for it, stood behind her, holding the rope. He looked up briefly, then back to his work. The minister walked on, stopping near the edge of the marsh where the fence posts leaned at uneven angles. The water lapped softly against them, a rhythm too slow to measure. In the distance, the fog lifted just enough to show the outline of the hill. The frame atop it still stood, broken, blackened, but still there. Each spring the villagers spoke of tearing it down, and each year the plan dissolved, like mist in sunlight. He looked at it now without fear. without the old ache of memory. It was simply a shape against the sky, part of the landscape, as fixed as the trees and the fields. He turned back toward the village. Children were running along the road, their laughter faint, the sounds small against the openness of the day. One of them carried a branch with the end smouldering, tracing lines of smoke behind him. Another chased, waving his arms through it. A woman called from a doorway, her voice sharp but not angry. The rhythm of living had returned, quiet and certain. At home, the fire had caught well. His wife was awake, kneeling near the hearth, the kettle already steaming. She smiled faintly when he entered, her face lined but steady. "It's warmer today," she said. "It will hold," he replied. They ate in silence, as they often did now. The sound of spoons against bowls filled the space that no words needed to. When they finished, she poured another cup of broth and left it by the window for anyone passing by, a habit she'd begun after the long winter. Sometimes travellers came through again, though fewer each year. The road had grown quiet, and those who still walked it did so alone, carrying little, their eyes fixed on the ground ahead. By noon, the clouds had thinned. The sun showed faintly through, pale but full. The air carried a different tone, not the brittle sharpness of cold, but the damp promise of thaw. The minister walked again, this time along the outer lanes, passing the fields that would soon be turned for planting. The soil still smelled of smoke from old fires. He stopped once, stooped, and picked up a stone from the edge of the path. It was smooth, dark grey, shaped by water. He turned it in his hand, the weight familiar, then set it back where he found it. The sound of a hammer came faintly from the blacksmith's shed. It was not the harsh rhythm of forging, but the slow, deliberate work of repair, the kind done when there is no rush. Each strike echoed gently, blending into the air like part of the day itself. As evening drew close, a thin haze returned. It came not from the marsh this time, but from the fields, the moisture rising with the change in warmth. The light softened until everything seemed caught between colours. Not day, not night, just the steady breath of one turning into the other. The minister stopped near the crossroads. The post where the lantern had once hung was gone still, but the ground beneath it looked different now. Grass had begun to grow there again, short and pale, fragile as thread. He knelt, brushing the soil with his hand. It was damp but firm, alive again after the long wait of water and ash. A cart passed behind him, the driver nodding in greeting. The sound of the wheels faded slowly down the road. The minister stood, dusted his hands, and turned toward home. The night settled gently, with no edge, no sudden darkening. Lamps glowed through the windows, small and steady. The air smelled faintly of earth and smoke, the kind of smell that clings to the first true evenings of spring. The minister and his wife sat by the fire, neither speaking. The flames moved evenly, not bright, not dim, the way they do when the wood is dry and cut well. After a while, his wife rose and went to the window. She lifted the cloth slightly, looking out toward the faint shape of the church. Its outline was clear now, even in the dusk. The tower still, the bell unseen but known. She let the cloth fall again. "It's quiet," she said. "Yes," he replied. She sat back down, her hands folded loosely in her lap. "Do you think it will stay so?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "I think quiet has its own way of returning." The fire shifted, a log collapsing inward with a soft sigh. Sparks rose briefly, then faded. The sound reminded him of the nights that had come before, the knocks, the voices, the hours that had filled the walls with something heavier than silence. But those sounds were memories now, not visitations. They lived in the wood the way heat lives after flame, invisible but harmless. When he finally stood to bank the fire, the coals glowed red and steady, the warmth holding its place. He looked once toward the rafters, half expecting the faint knock that had marked so many nights. But none came. The wood above was quiet, the air still. Outside, the fog moved gently through the lanes, lighter than before. It did not hide the houses or the fences. It only softened their edges, blurring the harsh lines until everything seemed joined. The sound of water in the marsh was faint but constant, the slow pulse of the land itself. The minister stepped outside once more before sleep. The night air was cool, but not sharp. The stars showed dimly through the haze, scattered but visible. The road ahead was pale in the moonlight, the mud drying in thin veins that caught the light. He listened, to the wind moving softly through the reeds, to the faint creak of a shutter, to the distant splash of something small in the water. The quiet no longer felt heavy. It was not the silence of waiting, nor of fear. It was the silence of things settling back into place. The kind of stillness that follows after something unseen has finished its work. He turned back toward the house. Through the window, he saw his wife sitting by the fire, her profile lit by its glow. The flames bent slightly, but not toward her, toward the chimney, upward, where they belonged. He went inside, closed the door, and sat beside her. The warmth met him evenly. Neither spoke. There was no need. The fire held its steady rhythm, the faint crackle a comfort rather than a warning. He watched the coals pulse softly in their bed, the light touching the walls in slow waves. When sleep came, it came easily. The village slept as well, the kind of sleep that carries no dreams worth remembering. The fields rested. The marsh sighed beneath its own breath. The hill stood as it had for centuries. The church, the fences, the empty crossroads, all lay still, as though the world itself had taken a long, measured breath and was content to hold it until morning. And when morning finally broke, it did so gently. The first light came thin through the fog, touching the rooftops, then the road, then the frozen puddles near the fences. The light moved slowly, patiently, finding every surface it had once fled. It did not blaze or burn. It simply arrived, the way all things do when their time to return has come. The minister woke to it on his face, the faint warmth of it pressing through the window's thin glass. He opened his eyes and saw dust drifting lazily through the beam of light. The air was still, the fire cold now, but clean. His wife still slept. He rose quietly, put on his coat, and opened the door. The world outside was pale and silent, but not lifeless. The fog was lifting, the sky showing its first true blue in months. The marsh shone faintly in the distance, its surface smooth. The smell of thawed soil and salt air mingled. Somewhere far off, a single bell rang, not from their church, but from another village along the coast, carried by wind. He listened until the sound faded. Then he smiled, faint and small. It was not the hollow bell of the night. It was the bell of morning, real and solid, meant for living hands. He stood for a long time in that thin light, his breath soft in the air, until the warmth found his skin. Behind him, the door creaked once and fell still. The lane stretched out ahead, damp and shining. The fog receded inch by inch, uncovering the fields, the fences, the paths that led in every direction, all of them clear again. And when the sun finally lifted fully above the marsh, spilling its first true gold across the village, it touched every wall, every roof, every stone, and every beam that had ever held a shadow. The light did not ask what it had missed, nor where it had been kept out. It simply filled the spaces as if it had never left. The hill stood dark against it, the marsh glistened beneath it, and the church caught its glow across the tower where the bell hung silent, heavy, ready for the next sound it would make, whenever that sound was meant to come. The minister stood there until the warmth reached the road at his feet. He took one breath, slow and even, and then another. The first light of dawn had come, and with it, the world had remembered itself. He turned toward the village. Smoke rose straight into the sky, the smell of bread already beginning to find the air. Somewhere a door opened, and someone laughed, a sound quiet but real. He walked that way, his boots pressing firm into the soft ground, the mist curling gently around his legs, the sun brightening above the marsh behind him. And as he walked, the fog broke completely, the last of the grey lifting from the ground and vanishing into the pale gold of morning, leaving only the smell of wet soil and wood smoke and the faint, steady sound of life beginning again, exactly where it had paused.